The idea for the trip started out simple enough: a weekend escape from the suffocating routine of city life. I'd been working nonstop for months, and my best friend Mike suggested a road trip down south. No particular destination, just driving with the windows down, music blasting, and a couple of days to forget about everything. It sounded perfect. We packed light, a couple of bags, a cooler full of snacks and drinks, and a playlist loaded up on Mike's phone. His old Chevy pickup wasn't much, but it ran well enough for the drive from Chicago down through Indiana and into Kentucky. We left early Saturday morning, eager to get away from the city noise and the stress. The first several hours were everything we'd hoped. We stopped in small towns, grabbed burgers at hole-in-the-wall diners, and laughed over stories that had nothing to do with work. The highways stretched out before us like ribbons, and the sun was high and warm, the perfect weather for driving. As evening approached, we found ourselves on a 2-lane road winding through the Appalachian foothills. It wasn't a route we'd planned, but the GPS had rerouted us to avoid construction on the interstate. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows through the dense trees lining the road, and the air felt cooler, damp almost. "Looks like we're taking the scenic route," Mike joked, but there was a note of unease in his voice. I nodded, but didn't say anything. The landscape had changed. The roads were narrower, the pavement cracked and uneven. Trees crowded the shoulders so close it felt like they might brush the truck's sides as we passed. We were miles from any real town, and the fading daylight made the isolation settle heavy. Then, suddenly, the truck's headlights caught something moving by the edge of the road, something tall and thin. But before I could say anything, it vanished into the woods. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice low. Mike squinted ahead but shook his head. "Probably just a deer." I wasn't so sure. The shape didn't move like an animal. It was upright, but it was gone before I could get a good look. We kept driving, but the feeling of being watched settled in with us. I kept catching glimpses in the side mirrors, shadows darting at the tree line. At one point, I could have sworn a figure was walking parallel to us, just out of the corner of my eye, but every time I looked directly, there was nothing. Night fell fast. The only light was from the truck's headlights cutting through the thickening darkness. We came upon a small, run-down gas station, its single pump under a flickering light. The place looked deserted, except for a shadow moving inside the dim convenience store. We pulled up, and I jumped out, stretching stiff legs. The air smelled of damp earth and something else I couldn't place. Mike stayed by the truck, fiddling with his phone. Inside the store, the fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered erratically. The shelves were half empty, stocked mostly with chips, canned soda, and candy bars. Behind the counter stood an older man with a face weathered by years and cold, deep-set eyes. "Evenin'," I said. He grunted in response. "Gas?" I asked. "No pumps working," he said flatly. "Power's out in town." I glanced outside, noticed that the lights on the building were dimmer than they should be. "How far is the next station?" 20 miles down the road," he said. "That is, if you want to drive through those woods." I laughed nervously, but didn't say anything else. I bought a couple of bottles of water and a pack of jerky and headed back out. Mike was staring at the tree line, his face pale. "You feel that? Like something's out there?" "Yeah," I said. "I don't like it." We got back into the truck and started up the engine. As we pulled away from the station, the shadow in the woods reappeared. This time it stepped into the light from the truck's headlights, tall, impossibly thin, with elongated limbs that looked like branches but moved like fingers. I slammed on the brakes, heart pounding, but when I looked again, it was gone. Mike swallowed hard. "We should get out of here." The next 20 miles were a blur of tense silence and quick glances. The road twisted sharply, the forest closing in on both sides. Every so often, shapes darted just outside the beam of the headlights. I wanted to believe it was tricks of light or animals, but my gut told me something else was out there, following us. When we finally reached a small town, relief washed over me. The streets were quiet, but there were people. We stopped at a diner, the kind with red vinyl booths and a jukebox in the corner. Over coffee, we tried to laugh off the night's weirdness. But when we left, the truck wouldn't start. Mike cursed under his breath, popped the hood, and fiddled with the engine. I stood watching the road, the thick forest looming behind us, and then I saw it, Standing at the edge of the tree line, just beyond the streetlight's reach, a figure, tall and thin, motionless, watching us. I called out, but it didn't move. The hairs on my neck stood up. Mike looked up. "What?" "That thing," I said. "It's back." Before either of us could react, the figure stepped forward, and the lights of the diner flickered, then went out, plunging us into darkness. We heard a scraping noise on the pavement, something slow and deliberate. I grabbed Mike's arm. Suddenly, the truck roared to life. Mike jumped inside and hit the gas. We tore out of town, the figure retreating back into the shadows. We didn't stop until we were back on the highway, far from that place. But the image stayed with me. The way the thing moved, so unnatural, like it was made of wood and shadow, we never took the scenic route again. Story the end. The day we left, it felt like any other trip. Just two friends looking for a little escape, a long drive across the country to clear our heads. My name's Alex, and my buddy Dave had been talking about this trip for months, ever since we both got out of college and realized how little we really knew about the world beyond our small hometown in Ohio. So we packed up my old Jeep, loaded the trunk with camping gear, snacks, and a playlist full of classic rock, and hit the road with no real plan beyond heading southwest toward the deserts of New Mexico. The first couple of days were straightforward. Highways, roadside diners, gas stations with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and nights spent under the stars at state parks. We stopped in small towns, met friendly people, and soaked up the freedom that only the open road can offer. The weather was warm but dry, the kind of early fall air that carries a hint of cold nights to come. We laughed, told stories, and reveled in the simplicity of it all. Then on the third day, we took a detour that neither of us would forget. We'd been driving through northern Arizona, skirting the edge of the Navajo Nation. The GPS told us to turn onto a narrow, unnamed road that cut through a patch of scrubland and red rocks, supposedly a shortcut to a small town called Tuba City. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky orange and pink, and the landscape was breathtaking in its wildness. But as the miles passed, something about the road unsettled me. The pavement was cracked, edges crumbling, and the shoulder was littered with broken branches and rocks. Dave joked about it, saying the road looked like something out of a horror movie. I laughed, but I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. The silence around us was almost unnatural. No birds, no insects, just the distant sound of the Jeep's engine and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. As we drove deeper into the wilderness, the sun disappeared behind a ridge, and twilight settled over the landscape. That's when the Jeep's radio began to act up. Static buzzed and crackled, and for a moment I thought I heard a faint voice in the noise, like someone whispering. Dave fiddled with the dial, but all we got was more static and a strange low hum. We stopped on the side of the road near a small clearing to get out and stretch. The air was cooler now, and the desert night was coming alive with the calls of unseen creatures. As we stood there, I noticed something odd. The footprints around the clearing didn't match ours. They were large, irregular, and seemed to circle us from every direction. I pointed them out to Dave, but he brushed it off. "Probably some kind of wild animal," he said. We agreed to keep moving, but the uneasy feeling clung to me. We didn't get far. The Jeep's engine sputtered and died without warning, leaving us stranded in near darkness on a deserted road. I popped the hood, trying to figure out the problem, but Dave's eyes kept darting toward the tree line. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. A soft rustling came from the brush, slow and deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove box and shone it into the darkness. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long, fingers like twisted branches. Its skin was pale and almost translucent under the flashlight beam, and its eyes glowed faintly in the dark. Neither of us said a word. The figure didn't move closer. It just watched. The air grew cold, and I felt a weight settle over me, pressing down on my chest. Suddenly, the Jeep roared back to life. Without thinking, we jumped inside and sped away, not daring to look back. We didn't stop again until we reached the next town, both of us shaken and silent. The rest of the trip was haunted by what we saw, or what we think we saw, out there in the desert that night. When we got home, I tried to find any reports of strange sightings or disappearances on that stretch of road. There was nothing. Sometimes late at night, I can still hear the whispering in the static, and I wonder if whatever that thing was is still out there, waiting for the next traveler to wander off the beaten path. Story the end. It was the kind of restless summer evening where the air hangs heavy and the horizon seems to melt into a slow-burning orange. I left my apartment in Columbus, Ohio, around 6, deciding on a whim to just drive. No destination, no plan, other than west. My 2002 Ford Explorer was packed with the essentials: a cooler filled with sandwiches and water, a spare tire, my old sleeping bag, and a worn-out copy of a map that hadn't been updated since 2012. My phone had a spotty signal at best, so I wasn't relying on GPS. The first few hours were smooth. The roads out of Columbus were well lit, the interstate humming with the steady flow of late commuters and trucks. By the time I reached Indianapolis, dusk had fallen completely, and the radio stations started blending into static and the occasional late-night talk show about ghost stories and conspiracy theories. I chuckled to myself, thinking about how perfectly cliché that was for the start of a road trip. I stopped at a gas station just before I hit the Illinois border. The place was one of those classic highway pit stops, where the fluorescent lights buzz softly overhead and the shelves are packed with everything from beef jerky to old paperback novels. I grabbed a soda and a bag of chips, and the clerk, a man in his 50s with a salt and pepper beard and tired eyes, gave me a quick nod. Nothing unusual, but something about his glance stuck with me, like he was warning me silently to be careful on the road ahead. Back on the interstate, the miles stretched out beneath my headlights like ribbons of black and white. By midnight, I was somewhere in central Illinois, where the flat land opened up into endless fields of corn, the stalks rustling softly in the night breeze. I pulled over at a rest area, thinking I'd take a quick nap before pushing on. The parking lot was nearly empty, except for one large semi parked a few spaces away. The driver sat behind the wheel, face illuminated by the glow of his phone. I drifted into light sleep, the sound of distant cicadas blending with the hum of passing cars. Around 3 a.m., a sharp banging on my car window jerked me awake. Heart pounding, I sat up, blinking into the darkness. The semi was gone. No one was around. I thought maybe it was just the wind or a branch scraping the glass. I shook it off, locked the doors, and started driving again. The road narrowed and the lights thinned as I headed closer to the Missouri border. That's when the GPS died. 1 minute it was there, the next it flickered out and refused to turn back on. My phone had no signal. The radio turned to static no matter what station I tuned to. I was alone on a stretch of highway bordered by thick woods on both sides with no streetlights for miles. I kept driving, hoping to hit the next town, but the road seemed to twist oddly, bending in ways that didn't match what I remembered from the map. Every few minutes, I caught glimpses of something, shapes that didn't belong, standing just at the edge of the tree line. At first, I thought it was deer or other wildlife, but the figures were too still, too human-shaped. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Suddenly, a pickup truck pulled out from a side road ahead, headlights blinding me. The driver waved me over, flashing a big, toothy grin. "Lost?" he called as I slowed. "I guess," I said. "Trying to find Lebanon." He nodded. "You're not far. Take this next left, then keep straight till you hit the old gas station. They're still open for a few hours." I hesitated, but the exhaustion and desperation for a place to stop made me nod. I followed his directions, turning off the highway onto a gravel road that wound deeper into the woods. The trees closed in tight, their branches scraping the sides of the car like fingernails. The gas station was a flickering neon sign in the dark, a lone beacon in a sea of black. Inside, the air smelled musty, like cigarettes and spilled soda. The cashier was a thin woman in her 20s with dark circles under her eyes. She barely looked up as I paid for gas and a pack of gum. "Where you headed?" she asked quietly. "Just passing through," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She shrugged. "Be careful. Some folks say the roads out here play tricks on you." I smiled nervously, thanked her, and got back in the car. The engine sputtered as I started the Explorer, then roared to life. I took the gravel road back toward the highway, but quickly realized something was wrong. The GPS was still dead, and the signs didn't match. I was lost. That's when I noticed the headlights behind me, closing in fast. The truck from earlier. It pulled up beside me and slowed to match my speed. The driver rolled down his window. "You okay back there?" I'm. I think I'm lost, I said. He nodded. "Hop in. I'll get you back on the main road." Something in his eyes told me to say no, but I was too tired and scared. I unlocked the door, and he climbed in beside me. The truck's cab was thick with the smell of diesel and old sweat. He drove slowly, the truck rattling over the cracked asphalt. As we drove, the woods seemed to close in tighter, the trees blotting out the sky. Then he started talking. Not about directions, but about the history of the area, about disappearances and strange sounds at night. "The place has a way of swallowing people whole," he said. "Some say it's cursed. Others say it's just the loneliness eating at your mind." I nodded, trying not to show how unsettled I was. After what felt like hours, the truck stopped in front of an old cabin, half hidden by vines and shadows. "This is where I stay," he said. "You can rest here for the night. No use wandering those roads after dark." I didn't want to say no. The idea of sleeping in the car in that thick, suffocating darkness was worse. Inside, the cabin was sparse but warm. A fire flickered in the hearth, casting long shadows on the peeling wallpaper. The man gave me a blanket and a cup of coffee. We sat in silence as the wind howled outside. Then, out of nowhere, I heard footsteps in the woods, a soft, dragging sound that made the hair on my arm stand on end. He listened, then frowned. "They're coming." "Who?" "The ones who never left." I didn't sleep that night. At dawn, the man drove me back to the highway. The GPS flickered back on. I was finally on my way. But I haven't forgotten those woods, those empty roads, or the man who seemed more a ghost than a person. Sometimes I wonder who was really driving that truck. Story the end. It was late summer when my 3 friends and I piled into my old 2002 Ford Expedition and set out from our small town in rural Pennsylvania. We had no grand plans, just a vague itinerary. Head west toward the mountains, maybe hit some national parks, camp along the way if the mood struck us, and get as far from the suffocating humidity and our daily routines as possible. The week ahead was a chance to escape. No work, no obligations, just the open road and whatever happened along it. The first 2 days passed without incident. Endless miles of highway flanked by dense forests, roadside diners serving greasy breakfast, and motels where the sheets never quite smelled clean. We sang along to classic rock and old country, laughed at inside jokes, and shared stories under the fading light as dusk settled. The trip felt timeless, like a brief pause from everything we knew. On the third day, we crossed into West Virginia, cruising through the Appalachian foothills. The roads twisted tighter here, the trees crowding the asphalt like sentinels. We stopped for gas in a tiny town with a single blinking stoplight. The gas station attendant, a wiry man with sunken eyes and a permanent scowl, told us about a shortcut through the mountains, a back road that would shave an hour off our trip. "Better watch yourself if you take it," he warned, voice low. Not many folks use that road, and it ain't exactly friendly after dark. We shrugged off his warning, eager to shave time off our drive and see the scenery. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, we veered off the main highway onto a narrow, winding road that seemed to disappear into the thick woods. The first stretch was beautiful, towering pines lining the narrow lane, birds flitting through the branches, the smell of pine needles and damp earth. But as the light faded, the road became less maintained, potholes and cracked asphalt forcing us to slow to a crawl. Somewhere near a bend, the engine sputtered, then died. My heart sank. I tried the ignition again. Nothing but a low clicking sound. The gas gauge was full, so I couldn't figure out what went wrong. We were stranded. It was almost night now. The fading light cast long shadows through the trees, and an eerie silence settled over everything. No birds, no insects, nothing but the rustling wind and the occasional snap of a twig. Jake, the most optimistic of the group, tried to reassure us. "I'll check for cell signal, see if I can call for help." He stepped out, phone in hand, walking along the shoulder. A few steps in, he stopped, stared down at the screen, and his face went pale. "No signal," he said flatly, "and it looks like this road isn't even on the GPS." Sarah frowned, hugging her jacket tighter. "Great. So we're stuck in the middle of nowhere, no phone, and no help coming." I glanced at the dark woods on either side of the road, feeling a prickle of unease. Then the headlights came. A single set of yellow beams flickered in the distance, slowly growing brighter. Relief washed over me. A beat-up pickup truck rumbled toward us, kicking up dust. It slowed to a stop beside our SUV. The driver's side window rolled down, revealing a man in his 50s, weather-beaten with graying hair and a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Need a hand?" he asked, voice rough but not unfriendly. Jake explained our situation. The man nodded slowly. "Engine trouble? Could be the old fuel lines around here. I got a toolbox back there. Let me take a look." We climbed out, grateful and eager to fix the problem. As he popped the hood and knelt down, I scanned the dark forest behind us. The trees seemed unnaturally still, their black silhouettes jagged against the starry sky. The man worked quietly for a while, then straightened. "Try it now." I turned the key, and to our relief, the engine roared back to life. "Thanks, man. Really appreciate it," I said. He nodded. "No problem, but if you're taking that road much after dark, you might want to think twice." We thanked him again as he climbed back into his truck and peeled away, headlights fading down the winding road. The moment he disappeared, a chill swept over me. We climbed back into the SUV and I started driving again, but the road felt different now, narrower, darker, as if the woods were closing in. Not far ahead, I spotted a figure standing at the side of the road. A woman, pale and thin, wearing a white dress stained with dirt. She looked out of place, like a ghost caught between worlds. "Who is that?" Sarah whispered. I slowed the car, peering through the windshield. The woman didn't move, just stared at us with hollow eyes. Jake said, "Maybe she needs help." Against my better judgment, I stopped. She climbed into the passenger seat wordlessly, her eyes fixed ahead. Her skin was cold to the touch, and a faint scent of decay hung around her. We drove in silence for a few miles. Then, without warning, she pointed toward a small, rusted sign that read Dead Men's Hollow. "I live there," she said softly. I glanced at the others. None of us spoke. The road twisted sharply, and the trees thickened so much that no moonlight touched the asphalt. Our headlights barely penetrated the shadows. Suddenly, the woman's voice changed. It became harsher, less human. "Turn here," she demanded. I obeyed, taking the narrow gravel path into the woods. We drove a few hundred yards before the road ended abruptly at a dilapidated cabin. The woman climbed out, then vanished into the night. We stared at the empty spot where she'd stood, unease mounting. Then we heard it, a faint scratching like nails on wood from inside the cabin. Jake crept closer, shining his flashlight through the broken window. Inside, a figure crouched, rocking back and forth. A man, his face twisted in agony. Suddenly he looked up and snarled, a guttural sound that froze the blood in my veins. We stumbled back to the SUV and locked the doors. As we drove away, the growling followed us, echoing through the trees. The next morning, we reached the town nearest to the highway. We told the local sheriff about what we'd seen, but he just shook his head. "There's been rumors for years about that cabin," he said. "They say it's cursed. Folks who go near it don't come back the same." We never took that road again. But sometimes when I'm driving alone at night, I swear I hear that growl in the distance. Story the end. That night started like any other late summer drive. I left Indianapolis just before dusk, aiming to make it to my sister's place in Nashville by the next afternoon. The plan was simple: 4 or 5 hours on I-65, a quick stop somewhere in Kentucky for gas and food, then another few hours down the highway. I was alone, a playlist of classic rock humming softly through the car's speakers, windows cracked open just enough to catch the warm night air. It was my first real solo trip, and despite a lifetime of road trips with friends and family, I had that familiar mix of excitement and nerves you get when you're heading into the unknown by yourself. The first few hours were uneventful. The interstate was busy but manageable, and the sunset turned the clouds a fiery red as I rolled through Louisville. I kept checking my phone for messages, but had spotty service once I hit the more rural stretches of Kentucky. No big deal. I pulled off at a small rest stop after about 3 hours. It was one of those places with an old brick building that had once been a gas station and a convenience store, now mostly abandoned except for a few vending machines and a couple of picnic tables. I got out, stretched, and tried to get a signal. Nothing. As I headed back to the car, I noticed a black pickup truck parked a little ways off, near the edge of the parking lot. There was no one inside. Odd, but I wasn't overly concerned. Maybe the driver had stepped away for a moment. I got back on the interstate and kept driving south. Around 11 p.m., the traffic thinned out considerably. The highway was mostly empty except for a few tractor trailers lumbering past. The road was flanked on either side by thick woods, shadows deepening as the moon rose higher. The air smelled faintly of rain, and distant thunder rumbled somewhere off to the west. That's when the car started acting weird. At first, just small things. The radio cut out suddenly, then flickered back on. The headlights dimmed for a second, then blazed back to full brightness. The engine sputtered once or twice like it was running low on fuel, even though I'd filled up at the rest stop. I pulled off at the next exit, an unmarked dirt road leading into the trees. I figured I'd stop, check the car. The rain started to fall just as I stepped out. It was a slow drizzle at first, then heavier, soaking through my jacket in minutes. I popped the hood and looked at the engine, but everything seemed normal. The battery was fine, the belts looked okay. I sighed and shut the hood, figuring I'd try to start the car again. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the woods behind me. My heart jumped. I froze, listening. The rain was falling harder now, and the growling stopped abruptly, replaced by a sudden silence that felt heavier than the darkness. I pulled out my phone and tried calling roadside assistance. No signal. I looked around, my flashlight barely piercing the rain and trees. No movement. I climbed back into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. It fired right up, the growling nowhere to be heard. I peeled back onto the highway, rain blurring the headlights and windshield. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, but the road behind was empty. As I drove, the car's behavior worsened. The radio switched stations by itself, tuning into static-filled broadcasts with distorted voices. The speedometer needle wavered, jumping from 0 to 80 and back again without me touching the pedal. The headlights flickered erratically. Then, the rain stopped abruptly. The woods to my left and right were cloaked in fog thick enough to swallow the headlights entirely. The road ahead vanished into a gray-white nothingness. I pressed on, nerves prickling. The fog seemed to press against the car like a living thing, and my breath fogged the inside of the windows. Suddenly, out of the mist, 2 bright lights appeared ahead. Headlights, coming fast. Another car? I slammed on the brakes, but the other vehicle didn't slow down. It passed me, too close, so close I felt the wind from its passing. But when I looked, the driver's seat was empty. I blinked and rubbed my eyes. The car was gone. Heart pounding, I gripped the wheel tighter. I kept driving, slower now, watching the fog and shadows. Then I saw her, standing by the side of the road, a woman in a long white dress soaked from the rain, hair plastered to her face. She was barefoot, pale, and staring directly at me with empty eyes. I hit the horn and flashed my lights. She didn't move. I slammed the brakes again, but the car skidded on the wet pavement. When I looked back, she was gone. I drove faster, gripping the wheel until my knuckles turned white. The radio burst into static, then a voice whispered, "Turn back." I shook my head, telling myself it was just exhaustion and the storm messing with my senses. Then my phone buzzed, a text message. No contact name. The message read, "Don't stop." I didn't reply. The road stretched out before me, fog swirling, headlights dimming, and I knew, somehow, I wasn't alone. Story the end. Kevin had always wanted to take a road trip across the American South, to feel the freedom of open highways and get away from his dull desk job in Chicago. So when his old college buddy, Eric, called him up one Friday afternoon with the same idea, it felt like the perfect chance. They'd map out a loosely planned route, nothing fancy, just hit the road with the windows down, music blasting, and no real destination other than the Gulf Coast. It was early October, and the air had that sharp hint of fall, cool but not cold. They met at Kevin's apartment, packed the small SUV with the bare essentials, and by 7 a.m. Saturday, they were already headed south on I-57, chattering about everything from old college pranks to what kind of bar they'd find in Nashville. The radio buzzed with classic rock and country hits, and the miles slipped by fast. Their first stop was a little diner just past Memphis, a weather-beaten place that looked like it had been there since the 50s. They grabbed greasy breakfasts, stretching their legs, laughing with the waitress, a woman named Betty who had stories longer than the menu. She told them to be careful once they hit Alabama, that some backroads out there were rough, and folks sometimes disappeared without a trace. Eric chuckled it off as local superstition, but Kevin made a mental note. They hit the road again, taking smaller state highways to avoid the interstate monotony. The sun was warm on their backs, the scenery changing from sprawling fields to dense pine forests. Around dusk, they decided to take a shortcut Eric had found on his phone, a winding two-lane highway that cut through a national forest near Tuscaloosa. GPS was spotty, but they felt confident. The road narrowed quickly, flanked by towering trees that swallowed the fading light. Soon the sky was a deep navy, and the only illumination came from the SUV's headlights, piercing the darkness. The radio started to crackle and then died. No signal at all. Kevin glanced over. "Cell's dead. Guess we're off the grid." Eric smirked. "Nothing like a little adventure." They pressed on, but something about the silence was unsettling. The usual night sounds, crickets, frogs, distant owls, were strangely absent. The forest felt suffocating, as if it was closing in around the road. Suddenly, up ahead, a figure appeared on the side of the road. A man, ragged clothes, soaked from what looked like rain, standing under a broken street lamp that flickered weakly. Kevin slammed on the brakes, heart racing. "Should we stop?" Eric asked, half joking. Kevin hesitated. The man's face was pale and gaunt, eyes wide and staring. Something was off. Before Kevin could answer, the man raised a hand and pointed deeper into the woods. Then, as if melting into the darkness, the man vanished. Eric swore he saw him step behind a tree, but Kevin was certain the spot was empty. "Let's keep moving," Kevin said, gripping the wheel tighter. They didn't say much for the next 10 minutes, tension thick in the cramped cabin. Then the headlights caught something, a pair of glowing eyes, low to the ground, watching from the edge of the forest. The SUV's engine shuddered. Suddenly, it stalled. "No way," Eric muttered, turning the key. Nothing. Kevin stepped out, flashlight in hand. Peering into the dark woods, the eyes were gone. A strange silence pressed down on him. "We should call for help," he said, pulling out his phone. No signal. Eric checked the map. We're miles from anywhere. No cell, no road service. Night fell fully, thick and suffocating. The air grew colder, and they felt watched. From the woods came a low growl, guttural and close. Their flashlight beams darted frantically, catching glimpses of movement, large shapes slipping behind trees. Then, the SUV's windows started to rattle as if something was pounding on the glass. They scrambled inside and locked the doors. The growling grew louder, mixed with high-pitched screeches and an eerie whispering that seemed to crawl into their minds. They huddled together, hearts pounding. Hours passed like this. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and they dozed fitfully. At dawn, the noise stopped. They peered out cautiously. The forest was still, but the ground around the SUV was shredded with huge claw marks. Nearby, broken branches and footprints that didn't look human. They had no choice but to start walking. The sun climbed as they stumbled down the highway, shaken and silent. Hours later, they found a small gas station still open. The clerk's wary eyes and quick glance at the woods confirmed their unspoken fears. They spent days telling the story to anyone who would listen, but most just shook their heads or called it an urban legend. Kevin still has nightmares about the eyes in the dark, the growls in the night, and the man who vanished. The pictures Eric took on his phone are all distorted, smeared with strange shadows and faces that weren't there. Sometimes when Kevin's alone at night, he hears tapping on his window. Story, the end. The sun was already dipping below the horizon when I pulled out of my apartment complex in Denver, Colorado, late one Friday afternoon. I had been itching for a solo road trip for months, something to shake off the weight of city life, the long hours at my office job, and the lingering loneliness that settled in after long weeks of working from home. I figured I'd drive south, maybe cross into New Mexico or Arizona, see a bit of the desert, and find a place to camp out under the stars. No fancy plans, no tight schedules, just me, my car, and the open road. I loaded up my old sedan the night before, stuffing in a small tent, a sleeping bag, a cooler with some sandwiches, bottled water, and a couple of cans of coffee. I had a paper map, too, just in case. My phone was charged, but I wanted to disconnect. No GPS, no internet, just following the highways and smaller roads. The first few hours were easy. Denver's traffic gave way to the wide-open plains, golden fields, and distant mountains marking the horizon. I rolled the windows down and let the wind in, the radio playing old country songs softly. The sky was clear, the air dry and warm. After a while, I stopped at a roadside diner just outside of Pueblo to grab a late lunch. The place was small but cozy, with a handful of locals nursing coffee at the counter. I sat down and ordered a burger and fries, chatting briefly with the waitress about the roads ahead. She mentioned a small town called Sanford, about 50 miles down the highway, that had a campground and a couple of motels. I decided I'd stop there for the night. The highway narrowed as I drove south, cutting through rocky outcrops and sparse pine forests. The sun was beginning to set when I reached Sanford, a tiny cluster of buildings that looked like they hadn't changed much since the 70s. Faded signs, weather-beaten storefronts, and a gas station with a single pump. I pulled into the gas station first, filling my tank and grabbing a pack of gum. The attendant was a middle-aged man with a lined face and tired eyes. He gave me a nod but didn't say much. "Looking for a place to stay?" he finally asked. I told him about the campground I'd heard of. He shook his head. "Campground's been closed for a few months now. Not safe anymore." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "Old owners ran off. Some folks around here say strange things have been happening out in those woods." I thanked him and got back in the car, a knot tightening in my stomach. I drove past the main street, spotting a small motel with a flickering neon sign that read, "Vacancy." The building looked run down, paint peeling, windows dusty. I hesitated but decided to check in for the night. The lobby was dimly lit, the wallpaper stained and curling at the edges. A young woman behind the counter glanced up, expression unreadable. "Room for one," I said. She nodded, slid a key across the counter. "Number 7, second floor." The stairs creaked as I climbed, the hallway smelling faintly of mildew. The door to room 7 was old and heavy. Inside, the room was small but clean enough. Threadbare carpet, a bed with faded sheets, a dresser with a cracked mirror. I unpacked just enough to be comfortable, then went out to grab some dinner from a nearby convenience store. The streets were quiet, and the few people I saw gave me wary looks. Back in the motel room, I sat on the bed with a can of soda, flipping through the channels on the ancient TV. Static and old reruns filled the screen. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I stood and looked through the peephole. Nothing but an empty hallway. I opened the door a crack. Silence. I closed it and locked the deadbolt. The rest of the night was restless. Strange noises, soft thuds and creaks echoed in the walls. At one point, I thought I heard whispering, but I wasn't sure. Morning came slowly. I packed up and was ready to leave as soon as the sun was up. On the road again, I headed toward a national forest area a bit further south, planning to camp for a couple of nights away from people and any weirdness. The drive was beautiful. Pine trees towering, streams crossing under the road, wildlife darting through the underbrush. I found a small clearing near a creek, set up my tent, and built a fire. The air smelled fresh, and for a while I felt at peace. But that night, the unease returned. Around midnight, I was woken by a rustling outside my tent. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the flap. Nothing, just trees and shadows. Then, from the darkness, I saw 2 bright eyes staring back at me. I froze. A large animal? A bear? The eyes blinked slowly and vanished. My heart was pounding. I packed up immediately and drove back toward the highway. The next day was a blur of empty roads, quiet towns, and an unsettling feeling that I was being watched. On a lonely stretch of highway near a small town called Willow Creek, my car broke down again. No signal on my phone. I walked to the nearest building, an old gas station and repair shop. Inside, the mechanic was an older man with a grim face. He agreed to look at my car, but warned me that parts were scarce and it might take a day or 2. I accepted. That night, I stayed in a rickety motel room above the shop. At midnight, I heard footsteps outside my door. I looked through the peephole. No one. The next morning, the mechanic told me that the locals avoided the forest after dark. Strange disappearances, odd lights, and eerie sounds had been reported for years. I didn't believe in ghosts or legends, but after that night, I wasn't so sure. When my car was fixed, I left Willow Creek as fast as I could. I didn't speak to anyone on the road after that. The final leg of my trip was tense, shadows flickering at the edges of my vision. At a rest stop, I saw a figure standing under a streetlight, watching. When I looked again, it was gone. I made it back to Denver days later, exhausted, my mind heavy with memories of empty towns, whispered warnings, and eyes in the dark. That road trip was supposed to be a break, a fresh start. Instead, it felt like I'd driven through the edges of something I couldn't explain, and maybe I still hadn't left it behind. Story, the end. Kevin adjusted the rearview mirror as the sun began to dip behind the endless stretch of highway. He, his girlfriend Sarah, and their mutual friend Mike were 3 hours into their road trip from Detroit to Asheville. The plan was simple: leave Friday afternoon, drive through the night, camp in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and soak in the last days of summer before the semester started. They'd crammed a tent, sleeping bags, and a cooler full of beer and snacks into Kevin's aged Subaru Outback. The air inside the car smelled faintly of gasoline mixed with pine-scented air freshener, and the stereo hummed softly with classic rock tracks. Sarah glanced out the window at the rolling hills. "I'm glad we're doing this," she said. "It feels like the last real adventure before school kicks our asses again." Mike, slouched in the back seat with his phone, nodded absently. "Yeah. Plus, it's nice to get away from all the noise, you know?" Kevin smiled, but kept his eyes on the road. The sun was setting fast, and they wanted to get to the campground before dark. A few miles down the highway, the trio passed a faded wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Ravenwood." Kevin had read about Ravenwood before. It was a tiny town nestled just off the highway, mostly overlooked by travelers. "What's the deal with Ravenwood?" Sarah asked, turning her head slightly. "Not much," Kevin said. "I think it's mostly old farms and some cabins. There's a gas station and a diner." Mike looked up from his phone. "Sounds like a ghost town." "Yeah, but if we run low on gas, that's our stop." They pressed on, the last rays of sunlight filtering through towering pines. Soon, the road narrowed, the trees pressing in on both sides, their branches scratching the car's roof like ghostly fingers. The radio started to fade, then crackle until only static remained. "Damn," Kevin muttered. "Lost the signal." "Typical for these parts," Mike said. "They say the hills block cell service." After a while, the gas needle dipped dangerously close to empty. Kevin knew they had to stop soon. They spotted the dim glow of the Ravenwood gas station's neon sign flickering through the trees. Kevin pulled in, the car bouncing slightly on the gravel driveway. The pumps were old-fashioned and grimy, and the small convenience store looked barely lit from within. A bell tinkled as they stepped inside. An older man stood behind the counter, his face lined and weathered. His eyes flicked up slowly as Kevin approached. "Evening," Kevin said, forcing a smile. "Can I fill up the tank?" The man nodded, but didn't speak. He shuffled toward the pumps, dragging his feet. Sarah peeked around the store. Dust covered the shelves, and the only merchandise seemed to be a few cans of soda and stale candy bars. Kevin paid the man and started pumping gas. The old man watched him, his eyes unnervingly steady. "We headed to the Blue Ridge," Kevin said, trying to make conversation. The man finally spoke, his voice a rasp. "Be careful out there. The woods don't take kindly to strangers." Kevin chuckled uneasily. "Thanks for the warning." Back in the car, Kevin started the engine. The night outside was thick and still. As they pulled back onto the highway, Sarah shivered. "Did you see that?" she whispered. "What?" Kevin asked. "There was someone standing just beyond the tree line." Mike laughed nervously. "Probably a deer or something." But Kevin couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching them from the shadows. The road stretched on, twisting through the dark forest. The car's headlights cast long, trembling beams that barely penetrated the blackness. Suddenly, the radio burst into static again. Amid the crackling, a faint voice whispered, "Turn back! Turn back!" Kevin slammed on the brakes. "Did you hear Gat?" she asked. Mike's face went pale. "Yeah, I did." Kevin reached to adjust the dial, but the voice repeated, louder this time, "Turn back." He turned to the others. "We can't stop here. Let's keep going." They drove in silence, the whispering seeming to echo from the trees themselves. Then the car sputtered and died. Kevin's hands clenched the steering wheel. "Not now," he muttered, trying the ignition again. Nothing. They were stranded. The air grew colder, and an oppressive silence descended. Sarah clung to Mike's arm. Kevin grabbed the flashlight and stepped out. In the darkness, the beam caught a figure standing at the edge of the woods, a tall man in tattered clothes, his face obscured. Kevin called out, "Hey, are you okay?" The figure didn't respond but raised a hand slowly. Then, a chilling wind swept through the trees, carrying with it a chorus of whispering voices. Kevin's skin prickled. "We need to get back in the car." They hurried inside, but the door slammed shut behind them. In the window's reflection, Kevin saw another figure, this one closer, its face pale and eyes black. They sat in silence, waiting for dawn. When morning finally came, the forest was quiet again. The car started on the first try. They left Ravenwood behind, but none of them ever forgot the night when the woods whispered warnings and the shadows watched with hungry eyes. Story the end. The sky was a dull gray as I pulled my old sedan out of the driveway in my hometown just outside Chicago. I had been planning this road trip for months. A solo trip to clear my head, get away from the endless city noise, and see some parts of the country I'd never been to. My goal was to head south through Indiana and Kentucky, maybe swing through Tennessee, and eventually end up in the Smoky Mountains for a few days of hiking and camping. I didn't have a strict plan, just a rough route and a couple of friends I'd check in with occasionally. I packed my car the night before, making sure I had enough clothes, food, water, and my camping gear. My phone charger and a couple of paper maps were tucked in the glove box just in case. I was eager to hit the road early, hoping to avoid much traffic and enjoy the sunrise as I drove out of the city. The morning air was crisp, and the roads were quiet as I merged onto I-65 South. For the first few hours, everything was routine. The radio played classic rock, I sang along quietly, and the highway stretched out ahead of me like a promise of freedom. The suburbs gave way to farms, then rolling hills, and by late morning I was passing through small towns with names like Lafayette, Seymour, and Bowling Green. Around lunchtime, I stopped at a roadside diner in a tiny town called Hazel Ridge, Kentucky. The place was one of those classic old-fashioned spots, red vinyl booths, checkered floors, and a counter lined with stools. It smelled like frying bacon and brewed coffee. I grabbed a seat at the counter, and the waitress, a woman named Marlene, smiled warmly and asked what I wanted. I ordered a burger and coffee, chatting a bit with Marlene while I waited. She told me Hazel Ridge didn't see many visitors, mostly locals passing through on their way to bigger cities. I mentioned I was heading toward the Smokies for some camping. "You picked a good time," she said. "The mountain roads are quiet now before the summer rush." After lunch, I filled up my tank at the gas station next door and hit the road again. The afternoon light was soft and golden as I wound through narrow two-lane roads flanked by dense woods. The map showed a small campground called Pine Creek about 15 miles off the highway, and I decided to try and find it for my first night under the stars. The turnoff was easy to miss. A faded wooden sign half hidden by overgrown bushes. The road to Pine Creek was rougher, gravel and dirt, and narrowed as I drove deeper into the forest. The trees grew close together, their branches intertwining overhead and blotting out much of the sky. The air smelled damp and earthy. After about 10 minutes, the road ended at a clearing. A small sign read, "Pine Creek Campground," but the place looked deserted. The campsites were empty, the fire pits cold, and the restroom building was locked up tight. I shrugged, parked near a picnic table, and started setting up my tent. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a chill fell over the campground. The woods around me grew still and dark. I built a fire with dry sticks I gathered nearby and settled in with a thermos of coffee. Then I heard it, faint, slow footsteps crunching on leaves somewhere in the shadows beyond the ring of firelight. I froze, listening. The footsteps stopped. "Hello?" I called softly, hoping it was another camper. No answer. The woods felt too quiet. No bird calls, no wind in the leaves, nothing but the heavy silence pressing in. I stayed awake for hours, the fire flickering low. Every now and then I thought I caught movement just beyond the light, a shadow shifting or a pair of eyes reflecting something dark. Morning came slowly, pale and gray through the trees. I packed up quickly, eager to get back on the road. As I drove out, I passed the empty camp and thought I saw a figure standing just at the edge of the tree line. I blinked, and it was gone. The next day was uneventful at first. I stopped at a gas station in a town called Maplewood, bought snacks, and chatted with the attendant, a quiet young guy with an uneasy look. He warned me to be careful on some of the back roads. "Some folks don't like strangers," he said without elaborating. Later that afternoon, I found myself on a narrow, winding road through thick woods. The sun was setting, and the shadows grew long. Suddenly, my car sputtered and died. I pulled over, trying to start the engine again and again, but it wouldn't turn over. I checked my phone. No signal. The road stretched empty and dark in both directions. I locked the doors and sat back, heart pounding. Then, in the distance, I heard the faint rumble of an engine. A pickup truck came into view, headlights cutting through the twilight. It slowed and stopped beside me. The driver was a man in his 40s, wearing a baseball cap pulled low. He smiled thinly. "Car trouble?" he asked. I nodded. "There's a mechanic in the next town, but it's a rough road to get there," he warned. I asked if he could help. He shrugged. "I'm just passing through." I decided to wait for daylight before attempting the walk. That night, as I sat in my car, I saw figures moving just beyond the headlights, silhouettes standing motionless in the trees. When I blinked, they were gone. The next morning, I made my way to the nearby town, which was little more than a cluster of houses and a single store. Inside, the few people I saw avoided my gaze. The mechanic's shop was closed. I felt trapped. I decided to hitchhike back toward the highway. A car pulled over quickly. The driver was a woman, friendly enough, offering a ride to the next big town. As we drove, I tried to make conversation, but her eyes stayed fixed on the road, tense and alert. Suddenly, she pulled over on a side road and said, "You need to be careful where you go around here." Before I could ask why, she sped off, leaving me alone on the roadside. By the time I got back on the highway, the sun was setting again. The sense of being watched never left me. Every small town felt deserted or hostile. Every dark forest whispered secrets I couldn't understand. By the time I reached the Smoky Mountains, I was exhausted and unsettled. I tried to enjoy the hiking trails, but shadows seemed to lurk just beyond the trees. I returned home early, shaken. The road trip was supposed to be a chance to escape. Instead, it felt like I'd been running from something. Something that followed me through the forests, the empty towns, the quiet roads, and maybe it still does. Story: the end. The summer after our senior year was supposed to be the best. My three friends, Emma, Tyler, and Sarah, and I had planned a road trip that would take us across 4 states, chasing music festivals, campgrounds, and roadside attractions. We pooled what little money we had from part-time jobs, rented an old van, and packed it full of snacks, camping gear, and a map dotted with places none of us had ever been. We left from Cincinnati at dawn, the sky already promising a hot day. The first couple of days were everything we wanted. Laughter echoing off empty highways, stops at greasy diners where the coffee was bad but the pie was good, and nights spent under stars so bright it felt like the universe had spilled itself just for us. We felt invincible. But the further west we drove, the more the atmosphere shifted. After crossing into rural Kentucky, we started noticing how empty the towns got. The roads narrowed, the trees closed in, and cell phone service disappeared. Our radio picked up only static, broken by occasional bursts of strange, unintelligible voices that made the hair on my neck stand up. On the 3rd day, Tyler insisted we take a detour he'd read about, a forgotten road called Hollow Creek Road. It was supposed to be scenic, winding through dense forests and past old farms. None of us had heard of it, and Google Maps couldn't find it, but Tyler was insistent. Maybe it was the thrill of adventure or just fatigue, but we agreed. The road was narrower than any we'd been on so far, cracked asphalt crumbling at the edges, weeds sprouting through the cracks. The trees pressed so close the sunlight barely reached the pavement. It was quiet, unnervingly so. Even the usual forest sounds, birds, insects, rustling leaves, were absent. We drove for miles without seeing a single other vehicle or house. As we rounded a bend, a wooden chair was sitting smack in the middle of the road. It looked old, paint-chipped and faded, and when we slowed down to pass it, I caught a glimpse of something in the woods, something watching. The unease settled like a weight in my stomach. Further down the road, we came across an abandoned gas station. The pumps were rusted and the windows boarded up, but a single dim light flickered inside. We debated stopping, but the uneasy feeling grew stronger, and we decided to keep going. As twilight fell, the road twisted and dipped, and suddenly the van's engine sputtered and died. We tried to restart it, but nothing. We were stranded. No cell signal, no other cars. We grabbed flashlights and backpacks and started walking toward what looked like a small town in the distance, hoping to find help. The forest seemed alive with shadows and whispers. Branches cracked behind us, but when we turned, No one was there. The path led us to a dilapidated cabin, half swallowed by vines and moss. The door creaked open as we approached. Inside, the air was stale and heavy. We found old photographs on the walls, faces faded, and eyes scratched out. On the floor was a journal, its pages filled with frantic handwriting about disappearances and something lurking in the woods. Suddenly, a door slammed upstairs. We froze. Then, from the darkness, came a low, guttural growl. We ran out into the night, branches tearing at our clothes, the sounds chasing us until we burst back onto the road just as the first hints of dawn touched the sky. A trucker picked us up, his face grim when we told him our story. He warned us never to take that road again. Even now, I sometimes wake up, hearing the whispers and feeling like something is watching just beyond the edge of the trees. Story the end. The summer I turned 24, I decided to take a solo road trip. After working 2 years straight at a dull office job in Columbus, Ohio, I needed something to shake the monotony out of my system. My plan was simple: pack the Jeep, hit the highway, and let the road decide where I'd end up. No itinerary, no strict schedule, just me and the open road. I had a few vague ideas of places I wanted to see: the Smoky Mountains, Nashville, maybe even New Orleans. But mostly, I wanted to drive, to breathe air that wasn't stale, office recycled air, to feel free. I told my mom about the trip the day before I left, and she worried, of course, but she knew me well enough not to push too hard. I left early morning, just before dawn, pulling out of the driveway with a tank full of gas and a playlist of my favorite road trip songs queued up. The roads were empty at that hour, and the city skyline disappeared behind me as I sped south on I-71. The air smelled like summer, freshly cut grass and pavement warming in the sun. The first day was uneventful. I stopped in small towns along the way, ate greasy diner food, and soaked in the changing scenery. As evening approached, I found myself crossing into Kentucky. The sun was setting behind rolling hills, casting long shadows over the landscape. By the time I reached a stretch of highway winding through dense forest, the sky was darkening quickly. I wasn't exactly sure where I was. My phone had lost signal about 30 minutes ago, and the only light came from my headlights cutting through the thickening night. Somewhere along this road, I saw a sign for a small town named Millfield. I figured it was a good spot to find a motel for the night. The road narrowed and curved sharply, flanked closely on both sides by tall trees that almost touched overhead. It was like driving through a tunnel made of leaves and branches. Suddenly, my headlights illuminated a figure standing at the side of the road. A man, I thought at first, tall and thin, wearing a faded jacket and a wide-brimmed hat. He stood perfectly still, staring at me as I slowed the Jeep. "Hey, you okay?" I called through the window. He didn't answer, just kept staring. Unease curled in my stomach. I tapped the horn lightly. No reaction. As I started to drive past, I caught sight of his face, pale and gaunt, almost too smooth, like a wax figure. I shook my head and drove on, the feeling of being watched prickling at my skin. I reached Millfield about 15 minutes later. The town looked deserted. Shuttered windows, empty streets lit by flickering streetlights. I found a small motel with a neon sign blinking "vacancy" and pulled in. The place smelled faintly of mildew and cigarette smoke. The woman at the front desk was middle-aged with tired eyes, but smiled kindly as she handed me the key to room 7. The room was tiny, but clean enough. I set my bags down and went outside for a cigarette, hoping the fresh air would calm my nerves. That's when I noticed a man standing across the parking lot, leaning against a tree, watching me. The figure was the same tall, thin man from the road, but now his face was obscured by shadows. I felt a chill run down my spine. I hurried back inside and locked the door behind me. Sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the old building set my heart racing. Around 2 a.m., I woke suddenly to a soft tapping at the window. I pulled the curtains aside slowly. No one was there. The next morning, I checked out early, eager to put distance between myself and Millfield. I told the motel clerk I'd had a restless night and wanted to hit the road. Back on the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still watching me. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw a flash of movement in the trees lining the road. I told myself it was just my imagination, exhaustion messing with my mind. As the day wore on, I stopped for lunch in a small town called Cedarville. At a gas station, I asked the clerk about Millfield. "Millfield?" She frowned. Haven't heard of it? You sure that's the name? I showed her a picture I'd taken of the motel sign on my phone. She took one look and paled. That place was shut down years ago, she whispered. People say it's cursed. Folks who stay there don't come back the same, or don't come back at all. I felt my blood run cold. Later that afternoon, I decided to camp in a nearby state park to clear my head. As night fell, I sat by the fire, thinking about what the clerk had said. Just then, a branch snapped nearby. I looked up. The tall, thin figure stood just at the edge of the firelight. It raised a hand slowly, pointing at me. I dropped my flashlight, scrambled to my feet, and ran back to the Jeep. That night, I didn't sleep. I left the next morning, taking the interstate all the way back home. Sometimes late at night, I hear tapping on my window. I never look. Story the end. The sky was already a bruised purple when I hit the road just outside of St. Louis. I didn't have much planned. A week off work, some cash in my wallet, and a longing for any place but the city. My car, a dusty old Honda Civic that I'd inherited from my uncle, wasn't much to look at, but it had always gotten me where I needed to go. I set my GPS for Denver, thinking I'd just make it a point to head west and see how far I could get before the miles or the money ran out. Traffic eased as I crossed the Missouri River, and the highway stretched wide and empty ahead. I rolled down the windows, letting the warm summer air carry the smell of late cornfields and roadside barbecue stands. I was listening to a podcast about roadside mysteries when the first odd thing happened. About 2 hours outside of town, my GPS flickered and went blank, then rebooted itself. When it came back on, it showed me off the highway, routing me down a thin, unmarked road I hadn't noticed before. I figured the GPS was just recalculating, so I ignored it and stayed on the interstate. The signal was weak but stable, so I thought no more of it. Hours passed and I kept driving through darkening farmland. Around midnight, my fuel light flickered on. I needed gas, and the next station was supposed to be about 5 miles ahead, near a small town called Redfield, according to the highway signs. I turned off the interstate onto the smaller road leading into town, but as soon as I took the exit, the GPS flickered again, then went dark. I pulled over to the shoulder and tried to restart the device, but the screen remained dead. My phone signal was non-existent too. I cursed under my breath. I hadn't expected to lose all service in what I thought was a populated area. I glanced at the gas gauge. It was barely above empty. I knew I had to find a station soon or risk being stranded. I looked around. The road was surrounded by dense forest on either side, and the dim glow of the town was just up ahead. I decided to press forward on foot to find gas and help. I locked the car and started walking toward the faint cluster of lights. The air was cool and thick with pine, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. The road was narrow and cracked, the edges overgrown with weeds. After about 10 minutes, I reached a small cluster of buildings, what looked like a gas station and a diner, both closed for the night. The station's pumps were old and rusted. The windows were covered with grime. A flickering neon sign that once read "Open" now sputtered and buzzed faintly in the wind, but the letters were mostly burnt out. I tried the door handle. It was locked tight. Next to the station, the diner was shuttered, the windows dark. A handwritten sign taped to the door said, "Closed until further notice." I felt a cold pit forming in my stomach. I glanced back the way I came. The road stretched into blackness. Just as I was about to turn back to the car, I noticed a narrow path leading from the diner's side toward the woods. Something about it caught my eye, maybe the faint flicker of light coming from a lantern hanging halfway down the path. Curious and desperate, I followed it. The path was barely more than a trail, winding through the trees, and the lantern's glow cast eerie shadows. After a few minutes, I came to a small wooden cabin. The porch light was on, and I could hear the faint sound of a radio playing an old country song inside. I knocked on the door. No answer. Then, cautiously, I tried the handle. It was unlocked. I stepped inside. The room was small and cluttered, filled with antique furniture, old photographs pinned to the walls, and a dusty bookshelf. The radio played on a crackling station, something about a local preacher's revival. I called out, but no one answered. The house smelled faintly of smoke and pine cleaner. I walked to the kitchen and saw a pot simmering on the stove with no flame beneath it. I frowned. There was no one home, but it looked like someone had left in a hurry. Suddenly, I heard a creak upstairs, a floorboard settling. I froze. Whoever was here, they might still be close. I backed out of the cabin and hurried back down the path toward the gas station. When I reached the road, I saw a figure standing under a flickering street lamp. The man was tall and thin, wearing a worn denim jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. I called out to him, "Hey, do you know where I can get gas?" He didn't respond. Instead, he turned and began walking away down the dark road. I hesitated but followed, hoping he was leading me somewhere open. After about 5 minutes, the figure stopped at another cluster of buildings, the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a ghost town. A diner, a motel, and a small general store. The neon lights buzzed and flickered, but none were fully lit. The man walked inside the general store, and I followed cautiously. Inside, the air was thick and stale. Shelves were stocked with canned goods and dusty jars, but the place looked abandoned, no one behind the counter. I called out, but the only response was the creaking of the old ceiling fan. Then I noticed the man standing near the back, staring at me silently. I blinked, and suddenly he was gone. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I turned and hurried back outside. The night had grown colder, and a thick fog was rolling in from the trees. I couldn't see more than 20 feet ahead. My heart pounded. I decided I had to get back to my car and find a way out of here. But as I walked toward where I thought the road was, the fog thickened. Shapes moved in the mist, shadowy figures just beyond my vision. I quickened my pace, but the road seemed to twist and turn unnaturally, leading me deeper into the forest. Then I heard a voice whispering my name, soft and urgent. I spun around, but no one was there. Panic rising, I ran blindly through the trees until I burst out onto a road, only it wasn't the road I'd come from. The signs were unfamiliar, the sky darker, my car was nowhere in sight. I fumbled for my phone, but still no signal. The GPS was dead. That's when I saw headlights coming toward me, slow, deliberate. A truck, old and rusted, pulling over at the edge of the forest. The driver's door opened, and the man from before stepped out, his eyes gleaming in the headlights. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. He gestured for me to get in, and without thinking, I obeyed. Inside, the truck smelled of diesel and leather. We drove silently, the engine humming through the foggy night. After a while, the man spoke. "This road doesn't want outsiders," he said. "They get lost. They wander. They never come back." "Who?" I asked, voice trembling. "The ones who live here," he said. "The ones who never left." I tried to make sense of what he was saying, but the truck suddenly lurched onto a narrow dirt road. Trees pressed in on both sides, their branches like skeletal fingers scraping the roof. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Time felt twisted. Finally, the truck stopped in front of an old cabin, barely visible through the fog. The man turned to me. "You can stay here tonight, but don't try to leave before dawn." I nodded, too exhausted and frightened to protest. Inside, the cabin was simple but warm. There was a fire burning in the stone fireplace, casting flickering shadows. The man gave me a blanket and sat down in a worn armchair, his eyes never leaving me. Hours dragged by. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying strange sounds, whispers, footsteps, the distant echo of laughter. At one point, I thought I saw figures standing just beyond the window, watching. When dawn finally broke, pale light spilled through the cabin's small windows. The man stood, his expression unreadable. "Time to go," he said. I followed him outside, the fog lifting with the rising sun. My car was parked exactly where I'd left it, untouched. The GPS flickered back to life, showing the familiar highway. I didn't ask the man any more questions. I just got in, started the engine, and drove. Over the next few days, I tried to make sense of what happened. I searched for Redfield on maps, online records. There was no town by that name in that area. The roads I'd traveled on didn't exist. I told a few friends about it, but they chalked it up to exhaustion or hallucination. Sometimes late at night, I still hear the whispers from that cabin, the voice calling my name through the fog. I keep thinking about the man in the truck and the warning he gave me. That road doesn't want outsiders. And maybe some places are better left unvisited. Story the end. The morning was gray and cool as I pulled out of my apartment complex in Nashville. I had been working a dead-end retail job for 3 years, and the weight of routine was crushing me. I didn't have a destination in mind, just west, anywhere but here. I packed a small duffel bag with a few changes of clothes, my phone charger, some granola bars, and hopped into my 2004 Ford Focus. The car had its quirks, but it was mine, and I trusted it enough for the trip. The highway hummed beneath my tires as I merged onto I-40 West, the city skyline shrinking behind me. The radio was tuned to a classic rock station, the songs blending with the hum of the engine. The first day was uneventful, miles of rolling hills and small towns flashing past my window as I made my way through Tennessee and into Arkansas. I stopped for the night in a small town called Mountain Home, a dusty place with a few diners and motels. The motel I picked was one of those old roadside places that looked like it hadn't been renovated since the 70s, but the price was right and I was too tired to be picky. The clerk was a middle-aged woman with a tight smile who handed me a key without asking many questions. The room smelled like stale smoke and cleaning chemicals. I showered, changed into fresh clothes, and sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the kind of exhaustion that weighs on your soul. I was halfway through a pack of crackers when I heard a faint tapping at the window. I froze. The motel was on the second floor, and outside was a thick row of trees. I told myself it was just a branch, but sleep didn't come easy that night. The next day, I got back on the road, heading into Oklahoma. The scenery was rougher here, rocky outcrops and dense patches of pine lining the highway. I was making decent time and feeling a little better, and felt the excitement of the open road chasing away the dullness of my old life. Around mid-afternoon, I passed a faded wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Pine Creek." The town was small, barely a blip on the map, but something about it caught my eye. I needed gas and thought maybe I could grab a bite, so I took the exit. Pine Creek was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The streets were lined with shuttered storefronts, and only a handful of people moved slowly along the sidewalks. The gas station was a weathered building with peeling paint and a rusted sign swinging in the breeze. I pulled in and went inside. The air was thick with the smell of oil and old tobacco. Behind the counter stood a man with a weathered face and pale eyes that seemed to pierce through me. "Heading west?" he asked without looking up. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. He nodded slowly. "Road gets rough from here. Not many travelers these days." I paid for the gas and grabbed a couple of snacks from the dusty shelves. As I walked out, I felt the weight of his gaze on my back. Back on the road, the sun was beginning to dip when I noticed the sky darken unusually fast. Thick clouds rolled in, blotting out the sunset. A storm was coming. I pulled off at the next rest area, hoping to wait it out. The rain came down in sheets, the kind that makes you want to hide under something sturdy. I sat in the car, listening to the thunder roll through the hills, when I noticed headlights approaching on the otherwise empty road. A beat-up pickup truck slowed as it passed, then swerved onto the shoulder just ahead. A man stepped out and waved me over. "Need help?" he called. I hesitated, but the kindness in his voice was genuine. I unlocked the door. He introduced himself as Carl, a local who lived nearby. He said the storm was worse than usual and offered to let me wait out the night at his cabin. I wasn't sure, but the storm was relentless, and the idea of being alone in the car wasn't appealing. I agreed. The cabin was modest, nestled among towering pines. Inside, it was warm, with a fire crackling in the stone hearth. Carl was friendly but reserved, answering my questions with short, clipped responses. As the storm raged outside, we sat in silence. I felt eyes watching from the shadows, but told myself it was just my imagination. When I went to bed on the pull-out couch, I heard soft footsteps outside the door. I called out, but no one answered. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean. I thanked Carl and left, eager to get back on the road. Driving away, I couldn't shake the feeling that Pine Creek wasn't just a sleepy town. It was a place people disappeared from, swallowed by the woods or something darker lurking beneath the surface. Sometimes on lonely stretches of highway, I still think I see those pale eyes watching from the tree line. Story, the end. This summer I turned 25. I decided to take a road trip across the country with my best friend, Jake. We'd both been stuck in our small Ohio town for far too long, and the plan was simple. Drive west, see the sights, camp under the stars, and avoid any serious plans or schedules. We left on a Thursday morning with a beat-up Chevy Impala packed with a tent, sleeping bags, some snacks, and a few essentials. Our phones were mostly dead zones. No maps, no GPS, just good old-fashioned road signs and a crumpled paper map from a gas station. The first few days were smooth. Endless highways cutting through cornfields and the rolling hills of Indiana and Illinois. We stopped in small towns, ate at greasy diners, and laughed our way through the long stretches of open road. At night, we'd set up camp near lakes or in state parks, lighting small fires and swapping stories under the stars. By the time we hit the western edge of Kansas, the sun was beginning to sink, painting the sky in fiery oranges and reds. We'd been driving since dawn and were both exhausted. Jake spotted a small motel on the side of the road, one of those old places with a flickering neon sign and peeling paint. We pulled in, hoping for a room and a shower. The receptionist was an older woman with tired eyes who barely looked up when we walked in. She gave us the keys to room 7 and warned us that the power sometimes went out at night, but that the generator would kick in. We took the room. It was basic, musty, but clean enough. After unloading our bags, Jake wanted to walk down to the nearby convenience store to grab some snacks. I stayed back, feeling uneasy but chalking it up to travel fatigue. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of a power outage. The room plunged into darkness, save for the faint green glow of the emergency exit signs. The hum of the generator outside was faint but steady. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming down the hallway. They stopped right outside our door. I held my breath, heart hammering in my chest. A whisper slipped through the crack beneath the door. "Why are you here?" I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry. The footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. I waited until dawn, then woke Jake. He hadn't heard anything. We checked out immediately, chalking the experience up to our overactive imaginations. We got back on the road, heading toward Colorado. The landscape shifted. Flat plains gave way to rocky outcrops and thick forests. The road narrowed, winding through mountain passes. One evening, as we camped near a small river, Jake found an old journal buried beneath some rocks. The pages were yellowed, ink faded but legible. It belonged to a man who claimed to have lived in the area decades ago, writing about strange sightings, figures lurking in the woods, unexplainable noises at night, and a growing sense of being watched. We laughed nervously and decided to leave the journal behind. That night, the noises started. At first, faint twigs snapping, distant howls, then whispers in a language neither of us recognized. Shadows moved just beyond the firelight. We tried to sleep, but something kept us on edge. At one point, Jake swore he saw a figure watching us from the trees. By morning, we packed up and left as fast as we could. The rest of the trip passed without incident, but the memory stayed with me. Sometimes when I'm alone on a quiet stretch of highway, I still feel eyes on me, watching from the shadows, waiting. Story the end. Driving across America has always held a special kind of freedom for me. The open road, the endless horizon, and the solitude of being alone behind the wheel. It's an experience that clears my mind and makes the everyday chaos fade into the background. That's why, one late summer evening, I decided to take a spontaneous solo trip from my home in Ohio to Texas. It was roughly a 15-hour drive, but I wasn't in any rush. I had no schedule, no expectations, just the road ahead and a tank full of gas. I left around 6 p.m., heading southwest on I-70 before connecting with other highways that would carry me across the country. The air was warm but cooling, and the sky was streaked with orange and purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. The radio played classic rock, and the hum of the tires on asphalt was a steady, comforting sound. By the time I hit the Pennsylvania border, night had fully settled in. The highway was lined by dense forests and rolling hills, the occasional farmhouse or small town lit only by a single porch light or two. Traffic was light, mostly trucks and the occasional lone car like mine. Somewhere near a place called Clarion, I began to notice the atmosphere shift. The temperature dropped suddenly, even though the dashboard showed a steady 68 degrees. The fog rolled in thick and fast, swirling around the headlights and obscuring everything beyond 50 feet. I slowed down, my eyes darting nervously between the road and the mist. My phone, which had been humming with sporadic notifications earlier, went silent. No bars, no signal, just the blank screen when I tried to open my map app. I told myself not to worry. I'd been through plenty of foggy patches before. Then the radio sputtered, turning into static. I fiddled with the dial, but the stations were all dead. I rolled the windows up and turned on the heater. The road curved sharply ahead, and I saw a faint flicker of light, a gas station sign, dim and flickering, just off the highway about a mile ahead. I decided to stop, stretch my legs, and maybe grab a snack. As I pulled off, the fog seemed to thicken, hugging the car like a cloak. The gas station was a tired-looking place with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign that spelled "Open" in broken letters. There was a small parking lot with a single pickup truck parked near the pumps. No one was around. I got out and locked the doors behind me, the air cool and damp on my skin. The fluorescent lights inside buzzed softly as I pushed open the door and stepped into the convenience store. The place smelled of stale coffee and cleaning products. A man behind the counter nodded as I approached. He was middle-aged, with a weathered face and tired eyes. "Long way from home?" he asked. "Just passing through," I said. He shrugged. "A lot of folks come through here late at night. Not many stop, though." I grabbed a bottle of water and a bag of chips and paid. When I looked out the window, I saw the pickup truck again, still no one inside. The man watched me. "You're headed west, right?" "Yeah," I said, feeling a little uneasy. He nodded slowly. "You might want to stick to the highway. The back roads can be tricky this time of year." "Yeah," I smiled politely, sensing the unspoken warning. Back in the car, I started the engine, and the fog seemed to thin slightly. As I merged back onto the highway, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the pickup truck's headlights flicker on. The truck followed me onto the road, tailing at a respectful distance. For miles, it stayed behind me, its high beams off, like it didn't want to be noticed. I tried speeding up, slowing down, but the truck stayed with me, silent and steady. After an hour or so, the fog returned, thicker and more oppressive than before. The headlights of my car barely penetrated the gray-white veil. The truck's lights disappeared into the mist behind me, suddenly sparked to life with a crackle and a faint voice. It was distorted, whispering something I couldn't quite make out. I turned the dial, but the voice remained, repeating the same unintelligible phrase over and over. I reached out and switched the radio off. At that moment, my car shuddered, the engine sputtering as if it was about to die. Panic set in. I coasted to the side of the road and killed the engine. Silence. I tried to restart the car. Nothing. I grabbed my phone again. No signal. I was alone on a deserted stretch of highway, surrounded by dense woods and thick fog. I stepped out, locking the doors behind me. The air was cold, the mist curling around my ankles. I looked down the road, but it vanished into the fog. Then I heard a noise, the crunch of footsteps on gravel. I spun around, heart pounding. Nothing. Just the sound of the wind through the trees. I felt eyes on me, a presence in the fog that I couldn't see. I hurried back to the car and sat inside, locked doors and windows. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, time lost meaning in the fog. Finally, the engine sputtered back to life. I didn't hesitate. I drove fast, desperate to leave the place behind. As the fog thinned and the dawn broke, I caught sight of the pickup truck once more, parked at the edge of the road, empty. I never found out who it belonged to or why it followed me, but I never forgot that night, the way the fog closed in and the silence that screamed. That road trip was supposed to be an adventure. Instead, it was a nightmare I barely escaped. Story: the end. The morning air was crisp and smelled faintly of pine as Megan slammed the last duffel bag into the trunk of her old Honda Civic. She wiped a sheen of sweat off her brow and glanced over at Josh, her boyfriend, who was juggling a steaming cup of coffee and a map sprawled across the passenger seat. The plan was simple: head out from their small town in northern Ohio, drive down the Great Smoky Mountains, camp near Klingman's Dome for the weekend, and then make their way back. Just a quick escape before the pressure of the new jobs and city life got the better of them. By 7:30 a.m., they were on the highway, the radio quietly playing some indie folk that Megan had queued up for the trip. The roads were mostly empty, the vast stretches of farmland and forests blurring past the windows. Both were excited, their conversation filled with anticipation and silly jokes about the bears they might encounter. As they crossed into Tennessee, the landscape shifted. Rolling hills gave way to towering ancient trees, their limbs stretching out like skeletal arms against the gray sky. The GPS flickered occasionally, but still worked well enough, guiding them through winding back roads that avoided the busy highways. Around mid-afternoon, they stopped at a roadside diner, a cozy little place with peeling paint and faded signs boasting homemade pies. The waitress, an older woman with a friendly smile, warned them about some rough weather heading in from the west and advised them to be careful on the mountain roads. The warning felt like a mild inconvenience at the time. They thanked her and continued on, the clouds growing heavier overhead as they approached the mountain foothills. As they ascended, the sky darkened, thick gray clouds swallowing the sunlight and turning the air chilly. Megan pulled over at a scenic overlook to snap some photos, the vast forest stretching endlessly below them, shrouded in mist. The tranquility was suddenly shattered by a sharp crack, a tree limb breaking under pressure somewhere nearby. Josh glanced nervously into the trees. "Probably just a deer," he said, but Megan wasn't so sure. Back in the car, they pressed onward. The rain began as a drizzle, then a steady downpour that blurred the edges of the winding road. Visibility dropped drastically. The GPS lost signal entirely as they climbed higher, and their phones followed suit, dropping to no service. The narrow mountain road twisted dangerously, slick with rain and littered with fallen leaves. Josh slowed the car, the tires barely gripping the wet pavement. Suddenly, headlights appeared behind them, a truck fast approaching and tailgating aggressively. Josh pulled over to let it pass, but the truck slowed, matching their pace. Megan's unease grew. "Maybe they're lost?" she suggested. Josh didn't answer. After what felt like an eternity, the truck finally sped past, disappearing into the mist. Minutes later, as the rain intensified, the car's engine sputtered and died. "Great," Josh muttered, trying the ignition again and again. Megan's heart pounded as the truck reappeared in the rearview mirror, slowing to a stop behind them. The driver, a tall man with a gaunt face and eyes too dark for the weather, got out and approached their window. "Need some help?" His voice was low and gravelly. Josh nodded cautiously. The man smiled, revealing uneven teeth. "Come with me," he said. "I know a place you can stay till the storm clears." Against their better judgment, the couple followed the stranger's truck down a dirt side road, disappearing into the forest. After several minutes, they reached a small cabin, isolated and surrounded by towering pines. The door creaked open before they could knock. Inside, the air was thick with dampness and the smell of old wood. The stranger gestured for them to enter. They hesitated, but had little choice. The cabin was sparsely furnished, dust-covered chairs, a fireplace, cold and dark. As night fell, the storm raged outside. Megan and Josh tried to get comfortable, but the unease lingered. They heard strange noises from the woods, whispers, distant footsteps, and something scratching at the cabin walls. Suddenly, the stranger's demeanor changed. His eyes glinted with something unnatural. "You won't leave," he said softly. Fear gripped Megan and Josh as the realization dawned. They were trapped. The cabin door slammed shut, locking itself. They banged on the windows, screamed into the storm, but no help came. Outside, shadows moved among the trees, watching, waiting. The night dragged on, the air thick with menace and dread. By dawn, the cabin was empty. Only the echo of footsteps and whispered warnings remained. Story the end. The sun was sinking low behind the endless stretch of highway as I rolled my beat-up pickup truck out of the small town of Prescott, Arizona. I'd been itching for this trip ever since I finished my last shift at the diner, an escape from the mundane, the grind, and the suffocating feel of small-town life. My plan was simple: head east, follow the back roads through the desert, and see where the night took me. I had a cooler packed with food, a tent and sleeping bag tucked in the bed of the truck, and a half-full tank of gas. I was ready. The road ahead was mostly empty, save for the occasional dusty car passing in the opposite direction. The desert landscape stretched out on either side, craggy red rock formations, sparse scrub brush, and the deepening shadows of twisted mesquite trees. The temperature had dropped quickly with the sunset, and I rolled the windows up against the cool night air. I had my phone in the cup holder, but no service, just the way I wanted it. After about an hour, I turned off the highway onto a narrow dirt road marked only by a faded wooden sign reading Pine Hollow Campground. According to my old map, it was a small, somewhat run-down spot, but it would be perfect for the night. The dirt track was rough, bouncing the truck on its old shocks, the only sounds the rumble of the engine and the tires crunching over the gravel. The moon hung low and thin in the sky, casting silver light over the landscape. The campground itself was more abandoned than I expected. Rusted fire pits, toppled picnic tables, and empty campsites choked with weeds. The small restroom building looked locked and boarded up. It was quiet, too quiet. No other campers, no distant voices. I parked near a fire pit, unloaded my gear, and set up my tent. I made a small fire, its orange glow licking the dark edges of the campground. I sat back against a log, sipping lukewarm coffee from my thermos, staring into the flickering flames. After a while, I started hearing noises, not animal sounds, nothing natural. It was a shuffling, scraping noise coming from the tree line beyond the firelight. I stood, flashlight in hand, scanning the dense brush. Nothing. I called out, "Hello?" The silence stretched. I shook my head and sat back down, trying to tell myself it was the wind or a small animal. Minutes later, a soft tapping sound started, like something knocking gently on the far side of the fire pit. I swung the flashlight beam around. Still nothing but shadows. I packed it in early, crawling into my tent, zipper pulled tight. The tent's thin fabric wasn't much of a barrier, but it was all I had. I lay awake for hours, listening to the scraping, tapping, and occasional rustle of leaves. Sometimes I thought I heard whispering, distant and unintelligible. Just before dawn, the noises stopped. Exhausted, I dozed off. The next morning, I woke to an eerie calm. The sun was just peeking over the rocky hills. As I packed up, I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt around my campsite. Large, heavy prints, not mine, not animal. They led into the forest but didn't return. I shook off the chill and got back on the dirt road, eager to leave. The next stretch of road took me deeper into the desert and closer to a tiny town called Red Mesa. The highway was long and straight, bordered by towering red cliffs. I passed a couple of cars, waving to the drivers. In Red Mesa, I stopped for gas and to grab a sandwich. The gas station was small, with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign. The clerk was an older man with tired eyes who watched me quietly as I paid. "Where are you headed?" he asked finally. "Just passing through," I said. He gave a small nod. "Be careful on those back roads out there. Now, not all of them are as empty as they seem." I smiled politely and got back in the truck. As I headed east, the sun dipped again, and I looked for a place to camp for the night. I found a spot beside a dry wash off an unmarked road. The silence was heavy. I pitched my tent and made another fire. That night, I heard footsteps again, slow and deliberate, circling my campfire beyond the light. I caught glimpses of movement, shadowy figures watching from the trees. I shouted into the darkness, but there was no response, only the sound of footsteps retreating into the desert. I never slept a full night on that trip. The sensation of being watched was constant, and strange things began to happen, small objects moving when I wasn't looking, my fire extinguishing suddenly, distant voices carried on the wind. On the last night, I tried to drive back to the highway, but found the dirt road I'd taken seemed to twist and loop unnaturally. Signs pointed in confusing directions, and landmarks I'd passed before were gone. I realized I was trapped in some kind of loop, the desert refusing to let me go. In the pre-dawn hours, the truck's engine died again. I was stranded miles from any town. As the sky lightened, I saw a figure walking toward me along the road, a man dressed in old, worn clothes, face obscured in shadow. He approached silently, and I noticed his eyes, empty, hollow. I locked the doors and tried to start the truck again. He knocked on the window softly. I didn't answer. When I looked again, he was gone. The sun rose fully, burning away the night's shadows. I finally found my way back to the highway hours later and drove straight to the nearest town with a motel. I never told anyone exactly what happened out there. But sometimes when the desert wind blows just right, I swear I can still hear those footsteps and whispers in the dark. Story the end. The sky was a bruised shade of purple when Matt's old pickup truck rolled out of the small town of Caldwell, Texas. He, his sister Jenna, and their friend Derek had piled into the cab just after noon that day, planning a weekend road trip to the Texas Hill Country. The three had grown restless in their everyday lives. Matt working odd jobs, Jenna finishing her last year of college, and Derek recently laid off from a manufacturing plant. The idea was simple: escape the small town, camp under the stars, and get a taste of freedom. The truck was packed with camping gear, coolers, and enough snacks to last a week. As they hit the highway, Matt was upbeat, humming along to classic rock on the radio, while Jenna tapped her fingers on the dashboard and Derek gazed out the window, scrolling on his phone intermittently. For hours, the road stretched out in front of them, a ribbon of black asphalt cutting through endless fields and clusters of live oak trees. The radio played their favorite songs, and the trio joked and laughed, the weight of their daily lives momentarily lifted. By early evening, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the rolling hills. Matt glanced at the fuel gauge. "We're getting low on gas," he said. "Should be a station coming up soon." Jenna pulled out her phone to check, but the signal was weak. "Looks like the next gas station is about 20 miles up the road," she said. Derek frowned. "That's cutting it close." Matt shrugged. "We'll make it. It's not that far." The highway narrowed, winding through dense forest now. The trees pressed close, their branches scraping against the truck like fingers. The sun sank quickly, and darkness began to envelop the landscape. After about 15 minutes, Matt spotted a faded hand-painted sign. "Gas, 3 miles." Relief washed over the group. They took the turnoff, the pavement giving way to a rough gravel road. The trees grew thicker, shadows swallowing the path. After a few minutes, an old gas station appeared, its neon sign flickering weakly. The building looked run down. Paint peeled from the siding, and the windows were clouded with grime. Matt pulled up to the pump and stepped out. The air was thick with the scent of gasoline mixed with something earthy and damp. Inside, the gas station was dimly lit. A single overhead bulb flickered. Behind the counter stood an older man with a face weathered by sun and wind. His eyes, dark and deep-set, seemed to pierce straight through Matt. "Evening," Matt said. "Can I get a fill-up?" The man nodded but didn't speak. He moved slowly, methodically, almost as if his body remembered movements long after his mind had left. Matt filled the tank, feeling the man's gaze heavy on his back. The silence between them was oppressive. Jenna and Derek waited outside, the wind rustling dry leaves around their feet. When Matt returned inside to pay, the man finally spoke, voice low and gravelly. "You don't want to be out there after dark." Matt laughed nervously. "We'll be fine. Just camping a few miles down the road." The man's eyes narrowed. "There's things in those woods, things that don't like visitors." Matt nodded, wanting to leave. Back in the truck, the engine roared to life, but the feeling of unease lingered. As they drove down the gravel road, the truck's headlights cut through thick darkness. The trees seemed to close in tighter, their branches scratching the roof. Suddenly, the radio erupted in static, and through the crackling, a faint whisper emerged. "Turn back!" Jenna shivered. "Did you hear that?" Derek nodded, eyes wide. "Yeah, we should listen." Matt's jaw clenched. "No way, we're almost there." But the whisper came again, louder. "Turn back." The truck sputtered and died. Matt tried the ignition, but nothing. The three stared at each other, the weight of the night pressing down. Matt grabbed the flashlight and stepped out. The forest was alive with unseen sounds, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, and low growls vibrating through the air. From the shadows, a figure emerged, tall, thin, and ragged, with hollow eyes and a smile that didn't reach his face. "Why are you here?" the figure asked. Matt stepped back, heart pounding. "We're just camping," Jenna said. The figure's grin widened. "This place belongs to me." They ran back to the truck, but the doors slammed shut before they could reach them. Trapped, they huddled together as the figure advanced, whispering promises of darkness and solitude. Hours later, dawn broke, and the forest was still. The truck's engine roared to life on the first try. They sped away, never looking back. The road trip became a nightmare they never spoke of again. Story the end. Kevin and Mark were two friends from Ohio who had been planning a road trip for months. Both in their late 20s, tired of their monotonous 9-to-5 routines, they wanted an escape, something raw, something real. Kevin had recently gotten laid off from his job at a local manufacturing plant, and Mark, a freelance photographer, was itching for a story. The plan was to drive down the back roads of the Midwest and South, camping under the stars, yes, and maybe catching a few small-town festivals along the way. Nothing fancy, just a chance to breathe. They packed Kevin's old Ford pickup with camping gear, a cooler full of food and drinks, and Mark's camera equipment. The truck smelled like old leather and gasoline, a comforting scent for Kevin, who had grown up driving trucks like this in his dad's farm. They set out early one Saturday morning, heading south from Columbus toward Kentucky. The first day was uneventful, a scenic drive past rolling hills, winding rivers, and stretches of dense forest. They stopped in a small town called Pine Ridge, where they grabbed a burger at a Greasy Spoon diner. The locals were friendly, but tight-lipped about the area. When Kevin asked about places to camp nearby, the waitress glanced nervously outside before pointing vaguely toward the woods behind the town. "You might want to stay near the old logging trails," she said quietly, "but be careful. Some folks don't like strangers around here after dark." Kevin laughed it off. "Sounds like a horror movie," he joked. Mark just smiled and snapped a picture of the fading sunlight through the window. They headed toward the logging trails, the sun dipping low behind the trees by the time they reached a clearing near an abandoned logging shack. It was the perfect spot, secluded, quiet, and surrounded by towering pines. They set up their tent, built a small fire, and cracked open some beers. As night fell, the forest around them seemed to come alive. The crackle of the fire was accompanied by distant howls, maybe coyotes, maybe something else. Kevin thought he saw movement between the trees, but blamed it on the shadows. They stayed up late, swapping stories and listening to the night. Around midnight, Kevin woke to the sound of footsteps outside their tent. He nudged Mark awake, and they both listened as the crunching noises circled their camp. Mark whispered, "Probably just a deer or a raccoon." But Kevin wasn't so sure. Suddenly, a voice, low and raspy, whispered from the darkness, "You shouldn't be here." They froze. "Who's there?" Kevin called out, heart pounding. No answer, only silence. The footsteps receded. The next morning, their cooler was overturned, and strange symbols were scratched into the dirt around the campfire. Mark's camera was missing. Shaken, they packed up and drove back to town to report the theft. The local sheriff was an older man with tired eyes. He listened, nodded slowly, and said, "You boys stumbled into something you don't understand. That forest's got its stories." They pressed him for details, but he just shook his head. "Best you stay out of those woods." Ignoring the warning, Kevin and Mark decided to continue their trip, but took a different route. Still, strange things followed them. Their phones lost signal, their maps showed roads that didn't exist, and at night, unexplainable sounds surrounded their campsites. One night, near the border of Kentucky and Tennessee, they stopped at a gas station in a tiny town called Hollow Creek. The attendant was an old woman who eyed them suspiciously. When Kevin asked for directions, she whispered, "Don't trust the roads after dark, and never follow the lights you see in the woods." That night, camping near a creek, they saw lights flickering deep in the forest. Drawn by curiosity, they ventured toward the glow, only to find themselves hopelessly lost. The woods seemed to shift around them, paths disappearing, trees closing in. The lights weren't lanterns or fires, but small, flickering orbs that floated just beyond reach. Panic set in as the temperature dropped sharply. Kevin felt something brush past his arm, a cold, clammy touch. They ran blindly through the darkness until they stumbled upon an old, rusted gate leading to a forgotten cemetery. The tombstones were cracked and weathered, many toppled or broken. The air was thick with decay and something far worse, an oppressive weight that pressed down on their chests. Suddenly, a chilling wind swept through the graveyard, and the orbs converged into a shape, a tall figure cloaked in shadow, with eyes that burned like embers. Kevin screamed, and the figure vanished. They ran back to the truck and didn't stop until the morning sun was high and the woods behind them were miles away. Back in Ohio, they tried to make sense of what happened. Mark's photos from the trip were blurred and distorted, faces hidden in shadows, shapes that didn't belong. They shared their story with friends, but were met with skepticism. Still, every now and then, Kevin would see a flicker of those glowing eyes in the corner of his vision, or hear footsteps crunching outside his window at night. The road trip had given them stories, all right. Stories they wouldn't forget. Story the end. Driving across the country is supposed to be liberating. The open road, the endless stretch of asphalt beneath your tires, the steady rhythm of miles passing beneath your car. For me, it was supposed to be a break from everything. My job, the city noise, the endless obligations. I'd planned it for months, a solo road trip from Chicago to New Mexico, taking back roads, exploring forgotten towns, and just losing myself in the landscape. What happened during those long, lonely hours on the highway, though, was something I'll never forget, and something I hope no one else ever experiences. I left Chicago early one Friday morning in late September. The air was crisp, but the sun was warm, promising a perfect fall day. My car was packed with camping gear, snacks, and a cooler full of drinks. I'd already mapped out the general route, but had left the details flexible, wanting to explore and make stops where I felt like it. The first few hours were easy. I rolled down the windows, letting the wind whip through the cabin, and listened to a playlist of old country and folk songs. The highways were busy but manageable, and I felt that familiar mix of excitement and peace that always came with leaving the city behind. Around noon, I veered off the main interstate onto a two-lane highway that wound through dense forest and rolling hills. The GPS was spotty, but I didn't mind. This was the part of the trip I'd been looking forward to. The quiet roads, the small towns that seemed frozen in time. As I drove, the sky grew cloudy, the light dimming beneath thickening clouds. A storm was rolling in, though the forecast hadn't mentioned it. The trees around the highway pressed close to the road, their branches reaching overhead like fingers, casting shadows even in daylight. I passed a small roadside diner with peeling paint and a faded sign. Inside, a handful of locals eyed me curiously, but nodded when I ordered coffee. The waitress was a woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes and a quick smile, but there was something about her that made me uneasy, like she was watching me more than just politely. When I mentioned the storm, she nodded slowly and said, "Storms aren't the only thing to watch out for around here." I smiled nervously and finished my coffee quickly, paying the bill and heading back out before the rain started. The storm hit just as I pulled back onto the highway. The rain was heavy and relentless, pounding the roof of the car and washing the road in sheets of water. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and I slowed to a crawl, headlights cutting feebly through the gray. Then, out of nowhere, I saw a figure standing by the side of the road. A man, or maybe a boy. It was hard to tell through the rain and gloom. He wore what looked like a soaked jacket and jeans, standing perfectly still, facing the woods. I slowed even more, expecting him to step off the road, but he didn't move. I glanced away briefly, then looked back, and he was gone. I swallowed hard, blaming the rain and shadows. Up ahead, a curve in the road led into a dense thicket of trees. As I rounded the bend, my headlights caught a flash of white, a woman in a long dress, soaked and muddy, standing with her back to the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding. The car fishtailed slightly on the wet asphalt, but I managed to stop a few feet from where she stood. I called out, but she didn't turn. Then she slowly turned her head. Her face was pale and gaunt, eyes dark and hollow. I hit the accelerator, skidding around her and back onto the road. The storm seemed to intensify, the rain turning to hail, hammering the windshield. The radio, which had been playing softly, suddenly switched to static. I turned the dial, but only eerie whispers filled the speakers. Then my phone buzzed. A text message. No number. Turn back. I shivered. The rest of the drive through that stretch was a blur of rain, fog, and that strange feeling of being watched. When I finally reached the next town, a small gaslit place with a cracked main street, I stopped at a convenience store. The clerk was an older man with a weathered face. I asked about the road, and he gave me a look. "Don't take that road after dark," he said quietly. "People who do don't always come back." I nodded, trying to laugh it off. I spent the night at a motel, windows shut tight against the storm. That night, I dreamed of the woman in white. She stood at the edge of the woods, calling my name. When morning came, I left that road behind. But for months afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brought something back with me from that stretch of highway. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear footsteps outside my door, and once in my rearview mirror, I saw a pair of glowing eyes watching me. I've never driven that road again. Story the end. The night we left Cincinnati, the sky was clear and the stars scattered like spilled diamonds. Me and my buddy Tom had been planning this trip for months, just two guys with a beat-up Ford Explorer, a couple of duffel bags, and a map that hadn't been updated since the early 2000s. Our goal was simple. Drive west, see some of the country's most famous landmarks, camp under the stars, and get as far away from our day jobs as possible. We started out with high spirits, blasting classic rock and swapping stories as we rolled down Interstate 70. The roads were smooth, the traffic light, and the air buzzing with that familiar road trip excitement. the promise of freedom, adventure, and maybe a little danger. We had no real plan other than to keep moving, stopping when we wanted, and going wherever the road took us. By the time we hit eastern Kansas, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows over the endless fields of wheat and corn. We pulled off at a small rest stop just outside a town called Mapleton, a dusty little place with one blinking traffic light and a gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. The attendant was a grizzled man who barely acknowledged us as we filled the tank and grabbed some snacks. "Keep your eyes peeled if you're taking the back roads," he warned, voice low and gravelly. "Not all of them are safe after dark." We shrugged it off, eager to take a shortcut he suggested that would save us about 20 miles. The road was a narrow ribbon of cracked asphalt winding through dense woods, the kind of place where the trees lean in like they're trying to whisper secrets you're not meant to hear. As the sun disappeared completely, the woods swallowed us whole. The car's headlights barely penetrated the thick darkness, and a strange silence settled around us. No crickets, no owls, just an oppressive stillness that felt almost unnatural. About 10 miles in, the engine began to sputter. I cursed under my breath and tried to keep the Explorer moving. The sputtering got worse until the engine died completely. We were stranded on a deserted stretch of road with no cell service. Tom and I got out, the cold night air settling around us like a shroud. We checked under the hood. Nothing obvious. The battery was fine, but the fuel pump sounded weak. We debated whether to hike back to town, but the woods pressed in on all sides, and every shadow seemed to watch us. As we stood there, headlights appeared behind, a large truck moving slowly toward us, its beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. The truck pulled over a few yards away, and the driver's window rolled down to reveal a man with deep-set eyes and a weathered face. "You boys need help?" he asked. Relieved, we nodded. He introduced himself as Frank and said he knew the area well. "I'll give you a jump," he said, pulling out a set of jumper cables. His eyes flicked toward the woods. "But don't stray too far from the road tonight." As he connected the cables and started the engine, I noticed something odd. A faint, sour smell like burnt rubber mixed with something else I couldn't place. The truck's engine growled to life, and with a final warning, Frank climbed back inside and drove off into the night. We got the Explorer started and hurried back to the highway, eager to put distance between us and that eerie stretch of forest. Hours later, somewhere near a small town in Colorado, we pulled into a gas station. The place was old, with flickering fluorescent lights and a faded sign that read, "Welcome to Pine Ridge." Inside, the clerk was a young woman with a tired smile. We told her about the troubles on the back road, but she just shook her head. "Lots of strange things happen around here," she said quietly. "Be careful where you sleep tonight." That night, we camped in a nearby state park, the dense pines whispering in the wind. But as I lay in my tent, I heard footsteps circling our campfire. Slow, deliberate. When I peeked outside, there was nothing but shadows and the glow of the dying embers. The next morning, the map we'd been using was gone, ripped out of the car and nowhere to be found. It was the last strange thing before we packed up and hit the road, eager to leave the strange silence behind. Even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us, waiting. Story, the end. Driving west out of Little Rock, Arkansas, the highway seemed to stretch endlessly into the fading daylight. I had no particular destination in mind, just a need to get away from everything that had been weighing me down for months. The months prior had been rough, a dead-end job, a messy breakup, and a deep, gnawing sense of isolation. So I grabbed my keys, packed some essentials into my old Jeep Cherokee, and told no one where I was headed. Just me and the open road. The first few hours were easy. The roads rolled through the sleepy countryside, fields dotted with cows and the occasional abandoned farmhouse. I rolled down the windows to let the warm summer air wash over me, the radio playing classic rock stations that crackled faintly between cities. I felt a small measure of freedom in that moment, a fleeting hope that the next few days might be different. As dusk began to settle, I realized I was running low on gas. The GPS on my phone flickered weakly. The battery drained faster than I anticipated. I spotted a sign for a small town called Ravenwood. It wasn't on any map I'd checked earlier, and the road to get there was a narrow, two-lane stretch winding through dense woods. Still, the promise of gas and maybe a meal was enough to steer me off the highway. The drive to Ravenwood was unlike anything I'd expected. The trees closed in tight on either side, their branches twisting overhead to form a natural tunnel that swallowed the fading light. The pavement cracked and buckled beneath my tires, and I slowed to keep control on the sharp bends. After about 20 minutes, the trees thinned out, revealing a small cluster of buildings nestled in a valley. Ravenwood looked like a town trapped in time. Wooden storefronts lined the main street, their paint faded and peeling. There were no traffic lights, no chain stores, just a handful of locally owned businesses that looked like they hadn't changed much in decades. A single gas station blinked its neon sign weekly, promising fuel and snacks. I pulled in, the gravel crunching beneath my tires. The gas pumps were ancient, the numbers on the dials barely visible. I popped the hood of the Jeep and began filling the tank. A man approached, his clothes worn and patched, his face weathered by years of hard work. "Not many folks passing through here these days," he said in a gravelly voice. "You're lucky we're still open." I smiled politely. "Thanks. I'm just passing through, heading west." He nodded. "You might want to be careful. Roads out here can get tricky, especially at night." I shrugged off the warning, assuming he was just talking about weather or wildlife. After paying, I walked into the convenience store attached to the station. The air was thick with the smell of old coffee and cigarette smoke. Behind the counter, a woman with tired eyes watched me silently, barely acknowledging my presence. I grabbed a soda and some beef jerky, then made my way back to the Jeep. As I was loading my purchases, I noticed a faded flyer tacked to a bulletin board near the door. It read, "Missing. Several residents of Ravenwood have disappeared over the past year. If you have information, please contact local authorities." A chill ran down my spine. I started the Jeep and headed back onto the road. The sun had just set, and darkness was settling rapidly. I kept my headlights on high beam, the beam cutting through the thickening fog that had begun to roll in from the forest. About 10 miles down the road, the pavement abruptly ended, replaced by a narrow dirt track. I slowed, wondering if I'd taken a wrong turn. The GPS was dead, no signal, no power, nothing. The road twisted sharply, flanked by towering pines that blocked out the sky. I could barely see more than a few feet ahead. Then out of the fog, I saw a figure standing by the roadside, a man in a worn baseball cap pulled low over his face. He waved me down. I stopped, lowering the window cautiously. "You lost?" he asked. "Yeah," I admitted. "I'm trying to get back to the highway." He nodded slowly. "Follow me. I'll lead you out." Something about his calm voice made me trust him despite the growing unease in my chest. He got into an old pickup truck, the engine rattling as he started it. I followed, the pair of headlights cutting through the fog. The dirt road led deeper into the woods. Trees brushed the sides of our vehicles, their shadows dancing in the beams. After a while, the road ended at a small cabin with smoke rising gently from the chimney. "This is my place," the man said. "You can rest here tonight. Roads can be dangerous out here after dark." I hesitated, but the thought of driving blind through that fog in those woods was worse. Inside, the cabin was warm, with a fire crackling in the hearth. The man introduced himself as Tom and offered me a cup of coffee. His eyes were sharp, his manner friendly but guarded. We sat in silence for a while as the wind howled outside. Then, faintly, I heard something. Whispers, barely audible, coming from the forest beyond the windows. Tom's expression darkened. "They don't like strangers." "Who?" I asked, unease creeping in. "The ones who've been here a long time," he said quietly. "The ones who never left." Sleep was impossible. Every creak, every rustle outside made me jump. At dawn, Tom drove me back to the highway. The fog lifted as the sun rose, and I finally saw the familiar signs of the interstate. I never found Ravenwood on a map again. I asked locals in nearby towns, but no one seemed to know it existed. Sometimes when I'm driving alone at night, I think about Tom, about those whispers in the woods, and about the town that vanished like a ghost. Story, the end. It was supposed to be a simple road trip. Nothing fancy, just me and my two best friends, Mark and Lisa, driving from our small town in Ohio out to the West Coast. We had a couple weeks off work, enough cash for gas and cheap motels, and the itch to get out of the city. The plan was loose. hit some national parks, camp if we felt like it, grab whatever roadside food looked good. We wanted the kind of trip that left you with stories and memories, not just photos on your phone. The first couple days were exactly that. Endless highways cutting through cornfields, small towns with their neon signs blinking like old ghosts, and the kind of late night diner coffee that tasted like motor oil but felt like magic when you'd been driving since dawn. We'd blasted our playlists, talked about everything and nothing, laughed so hard we'd almost crashed a few times. It felt good, like the world was ours. By day 3, we were crossing into Wyoming. We planned to camp near the Bighorn Mountains and then push on toward Yellowstone. The roads narrowed, winding between rolling hills and rocky outcrops. The air smelled different here, colder, crisper. Mark was driving most of the time. Lisa and I kept taking turns napping or keeping an eye on the maps. Late afternoon, we decided to pull off at a small roadside rest stop I'd spotted on the map. Nothing more than a gravel turnout and an old wooden sign that read Clearwater Springs. There was a creek running beside the parking lot and a handful of picnic tables under some tall pines. We figured it'd be a good place to stretch our legs and maybe grab some water. As soon as we stepped out of the car, I got this weird feeling. You know that gut twist? Like something's watching you, but not quite there. I brushed it off, probably just the wind or the way the shadows played through the trees. Mark laughed when I told him. Lisa just looked around quietly, her eyes sharp and serious. We filled our bottles at the spring. The water was cold and tasted fresh. I noticed a little trail that led off into the woods, maybe a quarter-mile long, but it wasn't marked or maintained. On a whim, I suggested we take a quick walk down it before getting back on the road. Mark hesitated. I don't know, man. It looks sketchy. We don't want it to get lost out here. Lisa shrugged. Come on, it's just a short walk. Could be nice. We headed down the path, the trees thickening overhead, the sunlight dappled and shifting. The air was cooler here, and the usual forest noises, birds, rustling leaves, seemed muted. After a few minutes, we reached a clearing. In the center stood an old stone structure, half collapsed like the remains of some forgotten shrine or cabin foundation. There were carvings etched into the stones, shapes I couldn't identify, almost runic. Mark was clearly uneasy. We shouldn't be here, he muttered. Lisa took pictures with her phone while I circled the stones, running my fingers over the rough surface. There was something hypnotic about the place, like the stones pulled your attention and wouldn't let go. I felt a cold draft despite the stillness around us. Suddenly, a sharp noise cracked through the air. Like a twig snapping, but close. We froze. No one said anything. I looked at Mark and Lisa. They looked just as tense as I felt. Maybe an animal, Lisa whispered, but I wasn't sure she believed it. We turned to head back, but the trail looked different somehow. The trees seemed denser, and the light filtering through was dimmer, almost gray. I stopped and checked the GPS, but it was glitching. The map wasn't loading right, and the little blue dot showing our location was jumping around like it didn't know where we were. Mark cursed under his breath. This isn't right. We decided to hurry back to the spring, but the path didn't lead us the way it should have. Every step felt heavier, like the woods were closing in. The strange silence stretched around us like a blanket. No birds, no wind, just this crushing quiet. Then we heard it again, a low, guttural growl from somewhere in the trees. It wasn't any animal I'd heard before. It was deep, almost human, but distorted, like something trying to imitate a person. Lisa grabbed my arm. We need to get out of here. We broke into a run, stumbling over roots and rocks, branches slapping our faces. The growling chased us, echoing from the shadows. I caught a glimpse of something moving in the corner of my eye. Tall, thin, too fast for a person. When we finally burst out of the trees and into the clearing by the spring, our car was gone. We stopped dead. The gravel lot was empty except for the wind twisting dried leaves across the pavement. No sign of the Honda, no sign of the luggage we'd left inside. It was like it had vanished. I fumbled for my phone. No signal. The battery was draining fast, even though it was nearly full before. Mark paced, muttering curses. Lisa was crouched down, tears running silently. I felt numb, cold sweat prickling my skin. What the hell just happened? I whispered. Suddenly the growling came again, closer this time, right behind us. We spun around, but there was nothing. Just trees and shadows. I tried calling out, but my voice caught in my throat. Then Mark screamed. We turned to see him on the ground, clutching his ankle. Something had grabbed him. Something with long, black fingers that looked like branches. I grabbed a nearby rock and smashed at the thing, but it disappeared into the woods like smoke. We dragged Mark back toward the road, but he was in bad shape. His ankle was swollen, maybe broken. We had no choice. We had to keep moving. We set off on foot, Mark limping between us, Lisa supporting him. The growling followed, but it stayed just out of sight. Hours passed. The sun dipped low. The woods seemed to shift around us, paths twisting like a maze. Finally, we saw headlights in the distance. A truck approached slowly, windows tinted dark. We waved frantically. The truck stopped, and the driver, a man in a hat and dark sunglasses, rolled down the window. "You lost?" he said, voice gravelly. We nodded. He told us to hop in. Relief flooded through us. As we climbed inside, I glanced back at the woods. The trees seemed to watch us, silent and still. The truck sped away down the highway, but I could still hear that growl in my mind. Story the end. The plan was simple. Drive from my hometown in Ohio down to New Mexico to visit an old college friend who'd moved there a few years back. It wasn't supposed to be anything special, just me, my car, and the open road for about 2 days straight. I was craving some time away, a break from the monotony of my office job and the buzz of the city. Road trips had always been my way of clearing my head, and this one was no different. I left early on a Friday morning, the sun just rising as I rolled out onto I-70 West. The weather was perfect, clear skies, warm but not hot, and a gentle breeze coming through the cracked window. I had a playlist queued up, snacks in the passenger seat, and a tank full of gas. The first day was uneventful. I made decent time, stopping only for fuel and quick food. I rolled into a cheap motel in St. Louis just before dark, ate a sandwich from a convenience store, and crashed early. The next day, I was back on the road before sunrise, heading toward the Ozarks in southern Missouri. I'd never been through that part of the country before, so I decided to take some smaller highways instead of sticking to the interstates. The roads were twisty and narrow, snaking through dense forests and rolling hills. The trees pressed in close to the pavement, casting long shadows in the morning light. I was somewhere near a small town called West Plains when things started to get weird. The sky had clouded over, and the temperature dropped noticeably. I stopped at a gas station on the edge of town to fill up and grab a coffee. The station was run down, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades. Inside, an older man with tired eyes and a thin smile rang me up. He didn't say much, just a grunt here and there. As I left, I noticed the sky had turned a deep gray, and the wind picked up, rattling the trees like they were whispering secrets. I shrugged it off and got back on the road. About an hour down the highway, the road narrowed, and the trees closed in tighter. The visibility dropped as a thick fog rolled in, clinging to the ground and twisting between the trunks. The headlights barely penetrated the mist. That's when I saw the figure. At first, I thought it was someone standing by the roadside, maybe hitchhiking. But as I slowed, it became clear this was no ordinary person. The figure was unnaturally tall, thin and unmoving, silhouetted against the fog. Its limbs were elongated, almost like branches, and it wore tattered clothes that fluttered despite the stillness in the air. I blinked, and it was gone. Shaken, I accelerated, eager to get out of that stretch. But then the car started acting up. The engine sputtered, and the lights dimmed. I pulled over, heart pounding, and popped the hood. Everything looked normal, but the car wouldn't start. I reached for my phone. No signal. Panic crept in. Then I heard it, a low, rasping breath from just beyond the tree line. I spun around, flashlight in hand, but the beam only caught the swirling fog. There was no movement, but the sound kept coming, steady and slow. Suddenly, a branch cracked behind me. I jumped and turned. Nothing. I got back in the car and locked the doors, trying the ignition again. Finally, the engine roared to life. I didn't look back as I sped down the road. The figure nowhere to be seen. When I finally reached a town with cell service, I called my friend and told him I was safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, or waiting. That night, in a cheap motel, I dreamt of the figure standing over me, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. I never took that route again. Story the end. The sun was starting to set as I pulled my car out of the driveway, the last of the day's light painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink. I was headed west, leaving behind the bustling city of Pittsburgh for the quieter stretches of Pennsylvania's backroads. It was supposed to be a simple solo road trip, just me, my car, and the open highway. I needed to clear my head, and the promise of miles of empty road was enough to keep me going. The first few hours were nothing but easy cruising. Country music on the radio, the hum of the engine, and a steady stream of fields and forests passing by. The air was crisp, and the early fall colors were just beginning to peak along the roadside. I kept my phone plugged in for navigation, but after an hour or so, I realized I was too far out for a reliable signal. No matter, I was mostly following the main highways, and I had my trusty paper map in the glove box just in case. Around 8 p.m., the road narrowed and the streetlights disappeared. I was somewhere between a few tiny towns, the kind that only show up as a dot on a map. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving me driving under an endless canopy of stars. It was peaceful, almost hypnotic. But then, somewhere near a place called Shadeville, things started to feel off. It started small. The radio kept cutting out. Static, bursts of white noise, then silence. I fiddled with the dial, but all the stations were dead. I figured it was just poor reception in the middle of nowhere. Then the headlights in my rearview mirror seemed to appear out of nowhere, far behind me, but they didn't move closer as I expected. No matter how fast I drove, they stayed at the same distance, like they were matching my speed perfectly. At first, I thought it was a tailgater, but this car never got closer or fell back. It was like the headlights were locked on me, maintaining the same position. The road was winding and narrow, lined by dense woods on both sides, and I was alone, except for this one car. The kind of place where you don't expect to see anyone. After about 10 minutes of driving like that, I saw the blinking lights of a small roadside diner up ahead, an oasis in the dark. I pulled in quickly and parked near the entrance, hoping the other car would keep going. It did. The headlights faded into the distance, disappearing down the road like they were never there. The diner was a little slice of Americana, neon signs flickering, the scent of frying bacon and coffee thick in the air. I stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling as I entered. There were a few customers scattered around, mostly regulars, and the waitress, a woman probably in her late 40s with tired eyes and a friendly smile, waved me over. I ordered a coffee and a burger, then sat near the window watching the road outside. The waitress chatted with me a bit, asking where I was headed and what brought me out so late. I told her about the trip, and she gave me a warning I should have taken more seriously. Shadeville isn't a place you want to linger after dark, she said quietly. Strange things happen out on those roads, especially when the fog rolls in. You might want to stick to the main highway and keep moving. I laughed it off, attributing it to small-town superstition. After all, everyone likes to have a few ghost stories. I finished my meal, thanked the waitress, and got back on the road around 9:30 p.m. The diner's neon sign faded behind me, swallowed by the thickening darkness. The next stretch was even more isolated. The road twisted through dense forests, and the trees seemed to lean over, blocking out the moonlight. I noticed the temperature dropping quickly, my breath visible in the cold air through the cracked window. Suddenly, the headlights behind me reappeared. This time they were closer, almost right on my tail. I glanced at my rearview mirror and saw a black pickup truck with no license plate, the lights glaring like twin eyes in the dark. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The truck tailgated me for miles, not attempting to pass, just riding my bumper. I tried slowing down, speeding up, even pulling over to the shoulder, but it stayed right there, waiting. The brake lights flashed erratically, sometimes on, sometimes off, and every time I looked, the driver's seat was empty. I swallowed hard and decided to stop at the next exit to get some distance. As I exited, the truck suddenly slammed on its brakes, disappearing behind me in a cloud of dust. I sighed in relief, but couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. I kept driving, the radio silent, the truck nowhere in sight. But then the fog rolled in, thick, wet, and heavy. It swallowed the road, and I could barely see more than a few feet ahead. I pressed the gas pedal, desperate to get through it, but the car began to sputter. The engine stuttered and died. I tried turning the key, but nothing happened. I was dead in the middle of the road, surrounded by thick fog and darkness. Panic set in as I grabbed my phone. No signal. I stepped out of the car, flashlight in hand, heart racing. The silence was oppressive. The trees loomed around me, and the fog swirled like living smoke. That's when I heard it. Footsteps crunching on leaves behind me. Slow, deliberate. I spun around, shining the flashlight, but nothing was there. Just the mist. I climbed back into the car, locked the doors, and tried the engine again. This time it roared back to life. I sped off, barely daring to breathe. Then I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road, barely visible through the fog. It was tall and thin, dressed in what looked like a tattered coat, its face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. I slammed the brakes, but stopped just inches from the figure. It didn't move. The radio flickered on, static buzzing, and through it came a whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." My skin crawled. The figure vanished. I didn't stop driving until the fog thinned and the lights of a town appeared ahead. I never took that back road again. Story the end. The summer after college graduation, my 3 friends and I decided to take a road trip across the country. We'd spent years talking about it, dreaming about the freedom of the open road, the endless possibilities of adventure, and the kind of memories that would last a lifetime. It was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. No schedules, just a beat-up van, a couple of tents, and a map dotted with iconic stops. National parks, small towns, weird roadside attractions. We were in our early 20s, reckless and invincible, or at least that's what we thought. We left from Columbus, Ohio in late June. The plan was simple: head west toward the Rockies, then down into California, and back east along the southern states. There was Emma, our designated driver, cool-headed and steady behind the wheel. Josh was the jokester, always ready with a story or a sarcastic comment. Me, well, I was the planner, trying to keep track of our route and where to sleep each night. And then there was Sam, the quiet one who kept to himself but never complained. The first few days were everything we'd hoped for. Rolling hills giving way to endless plains, giant sky stretching out overhead, the kind of sunsets that make you stop the car just to stare. We camped outside Omaha, woke up to the smell of pine needles and campfire smoke. The van was cramped, but it felt like home. Music blasted from the speakers, and we laughed until our sides hurt. But on the 4th night, somewhere in western Nebraska, things changed. We'd decided to take a detour, a shortcut Josh had found on some online forum. It was supposed to shave off a few hours and get us closer to the Black Hills by morning. The road started as a 2-lane highway, but quickly narrowed into a dirt track cutting through dense woods. The sun was low when we turned off, and the GPS signal flickered and died. Our phones were useless. Emma tried to stay calm as she navigated the uneven terrain, but even she was tense. The trees pressed close on both sides, their branches scratching the sides of the van. The road twisted and turned, the tires crunching over loose gravel and fallen leaves. The air smelled different here, heavier, damp, and earthy, like the forest was breathing around us. After about 20 minutes, we reached a clearing. There was an old gas station, or what was left of one, its paint peeling and windows boarded up. A faded sign creaked in the breeze, advertising Marvin's Fuel. None of us had heard of the place, and it didn't show up on any maps. Josh joked about how it looked like something out of a horror movie, but his voice had an edge of nervous laughter. Sam didn't say anything. He just stared out the window, his eyes dark. We decided to keep going. The road beyond the gas station was barely more than a trail, twisting deeper into the woods. The sun slipped behind the trees and the sky darkened rapidly. Then the van sputtered. Emma cursed under her breath as the engine died. We coasted to a stop, headlights illuminating nothing but shadows. We tried restarting the engine, but it was useless. No battery power, no spark. We were stranded. The radio crackled to life suddenly, a burst of static followed by a voice, faint and distorted. Emma reached for it, hoping for a weather report or emergency broadcast, but the voice only repeated a string of numbers and letters we couldn't understand. A cold wind swept through the trees, carrying with it a faint whisper, almost like voices just beyond hearing. Josh laughed nervously and said it was just our imagination. Sam didn't respond. We decided to get out and look around for help, but as soon as the door opened, the temperature dropped sharply. The air felt thick, almost viscous, and the forest around us seemed unnaturally silent. We didn't see anything at first, but then Emma pointed into the woods. There were footprints in the dirt, large and not human. They looked like animal tracks, but far too big. They vanished into the underbrush, disappearing before we could follow. Suddenly, from deeper in the forest, a low growl echoed. We froze, the hairs on the back of our necks standing up. Then the sound of twigs snapping and leaves rustling as something moved just beyond the trees. "Let's get back in the van," Emma said, her voice tight. We slammed the doors and locked them, but the growling grew louder, circling the vehicle. The radio crackled again, louder this time, with what sounded like a man's voice whispering, "Leave, now." The van's interior lights flickered, and for a moment we all thought we saw a shadow pass by the windows. Tall, thin, and moving with unnatural speed. Emma tried the engine again, and with a cough, it roared back to life. We didn't hesitate. Tires spinning, we sped away down the narrow trail, the growls chasing us until the road finally widened into a paved highway. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, where we filled the gas tank, called for a mechanic, and tried to piece together what happened. No one in town had heard of Marvin's fuel station or any road like the one we took. The locals exchanged uneasy glances when we mentioned the forest. One older man told us about an old legend, about a creature that stalked the woods, watching travelers, luring them off the roads to disappear forever. We tried to laugh it off, but none of us could forget the growls, the footprints, the whispering voice on the radio. The rest of the trip was quieter. We avoided side roads, stuck to the main highways, and rarely stopped after dark. Sam barely spoke after that night, and I could see the fear in his eyes. When we finally got back to Ohio, the van was hauled to a mechanic. The engine had strange damage, but no clear explanation. The radio was broken, dead. We never spoke about that night again, not until now. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear a faint whisper in my dreams, warning me to leave, to never go back. If you're ever driving through western Nebraska and see an old sign for Marvin's Fuel, don't stop, keep driving. The woods there don't forgive mistakes, because out there, something's waiting. Story the end. The sun was just beginning to crest the horizon when Kevin and his girlfriend, Mia, loaded their beaten-up Jeep with camping gear and snacks, ready for a weekend road trip through the remote stretches of the Appalachian Mountains. They'd spent weeks planning this getaway, a chance to escape the city's noise and reconnect with nature before the pressure of Kevin's new job took hold. The drive out of Atlanta was smooth, the early morning light casting a golden hue across the rolling hills. Kevin took the wheel first, while Mia scrolled through playlists on her phone, trying to find the perfect soundtrack for their trip. They had no real destination in mind, just a rough plan to camp near a small lake about 2 hours out, somewhere in the Nantahala National Forest. By mid-morning, they'd left the interstate behind, winding onto narrow, two-lane highways shaded by dense trees. The forest felt alive, full of birdsong and rustling leaves. Kevin and Mia stopped at a small roadside market to pick up fresh sandwiches and a few cans of beer, chatting with the friendly old man who ran it. He warned them about some road closures ahead due to recent storms, but shrugged it off when Kevin asked if they might find alternate routes. "This forest can be tricky," the man said, eyes glinting with something unreadable. They pressed on, confident. The weather was perfect, crisp and clear, with just a hint of fall in the air. Kevin hummed along to the radio while Mia navigated using a paper map since cell service had already started to fade. About an hour in, the road narrowed and twisted sharply, climbing steeply through thick woods. The trees grew closer and the canopy above darkened, filtering out most of the sunlight. Kevin slowed the Jeep, careful on the slick pavement left from a recent rain. Then the Jeep's engine sputtered once, twice, and died completely. "Damn," Kevin muttered, turning the key again with no luck. Mia's face tightened as she checked her phone. No signal. They were completely cut off. They tried the emergency roadside assistance number, but it was dead. Kevin grabbed the flashlight and stepped out into the cool forest air, trying to see if anything was wrong under the hood. The silence around them was heavy, broken only by the distant call of a bird and the soft whisper of the wind through the leaves. "That's weird," Kevin said, noticing the gas gauge was still half full. "It shouldn't have died like that." Mia pulled her jacket tighter, glancing nervously at the trees. Maybe we should stay here until morning? Try to walk back to the main road? Kevin shook his head. No way. It's pitch dark in a couple of hours. Better we try to fix it now or find help. They agreed to stay with the Jeep for the time being. Kevin tried everything he could think of, but the engine stayed dead. The forest around them grew darker, and the shadows stretched longer. As dusk fell, an uneasy feeling settled over them, as if unseen eyes were watching from the trees. Kevin noticed movement just beyond the edge of the headlights, something darting between the trunks. A pair of glowing eyes flicked briefly, then vanished. "Did you see that?" Mia whispered, clutching his arm. "Probably just a deer," Kevin said, but even he wasn't sure. They locked the doors, huddling together in the cab, trying to stay calm. The temperature dropped rapidly, and the forest sounds became eerie. Twigs snapping too close, the hoot of an owl sounding almost urgent. Hours passed with little sleep. Around midnight, a slow tapping began on the passenger window. Both jumped, staring into the foggy darkness outside. Kevin grabbed the flashlight and shone it on the window. Nothing was there, but the tapping continued, slow, deliberate, like fingernails. They locked eyes, breath caught. Suddenly, from the forest came a low growl, deep and guttural. Mia started sobbing quietly. Kevin felt the hair on his neck stand up. The tapping stopped. The growling faded into the night. They sat frozen, waiting for dawn. When first light finally filtered through the canopy, Kevin opened the door cautiously. The forest floor was littered with strange markings. Long scratch marks gouged into tree trunks and the ground. There were patches of disturbed dirt and strange footprints, too large and irregular to be human. They gathered what they could and started walking down the road, hoping to find help or another vehicle. The Jeep was abandoned. After hours of hiking, they spotted a small cabin nestled in a clearing. Smoke curled from the chimney. They approached, relief flooding through them. An older woman opened the door, eyes sharp and wary. She invited them inside. Kevin and Mia explained their situation, showing the scratches and footprints. The woman's face darkened. "You're lucky to be alive. That forest is old and angry. Those marks, the ones you saw, that's no animal. People call it the Wendigo." Kevin frowned. "Wendigo? Isn't that just a legend?" The woman shook her head slowly. "Not around here. It's a spirit. Hungry. It hunts those who wander too far. It can change shape, make sounds like humans. It's cruel. It drives people mad, or worse." Kevin and Mia exchanged glances, the fear settling in their bones. They stayed in the cabin overnight, but the sounds of the forest never stopped. Scraping, whispers, unexplainable rustling. The woman gave them a talisman for protection and warned them to stay close. The next morning, they made their way back to the main road, eventually finding a park ranger station. The ranger listened to their story, then confirmed that several people had gone missing recently in the area. The local authorities rarely searched the woods due to the difficult terrain and strange occurrences. Kevin and Mia left immediately, driving back toward Atlanta in silence. The forest had left a mark on them, one that would never fade. Days later, when they looked at the photos Mia had taken during the trip, there were shapes and faces in the shadows they hadn't noticed before. Eyes glowed faintly, watching from the darkness. Sometimes at night, Kevin swore he heard faint tapping on his window. Story the end. The late spring sun was starting to dip below the horizon as I pulled my old pickup truck out of my driveway in rural Ohio. I had been itching for a road trip for months, a break from the city and the stress of the day job. Just me, my truck, and the open road. The plan was simple. Drive south, maybe hit some back roads, small towns, and see where the wind took me. I told my friends I'd be off the grid for a few days. No calls, no messages. Just a chance to clear my head and breathe. The first few hours were pleasant enough. The radio was tuned to classic rock. The truck's worn leather seats familiar and comforting. I rolled down the windows, letting in the warm spring air mixed with the smell of fresh earth and blooming wildflowers. As I cruised along the two-lane highways, the traffic thinned. I passed a few farmhouses, some barns with peeling paint, fields of green stretching out like a patchwork quilt. I had a loose itinerary. Spend the night in some small town, maybe a roadside motel or a campground, then keep heading south. I was aiming for the Appalachian foothills, but wasn't in any rush. By the time dusk was settling, I found myself near a town called Millfield, a tiny dot on the map I barely remembered passing through once on a cross-country trip years ago. The main road was lined with a few small businesses, a gas station, a diner, a hardware store. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone. I pulled into the gas station, planning to fill up and grab some snacks for the night. The place was quiet, the attendant an older man with a weathered face and slow movements. He nodded when I said hi, but didn't say much else. "Road trip?" he asked after a moment, his voice rough like gravel. "Yeah," I said, smiling. "Just trying to get away for a bit." He gave a short nod, then stared off down the empty street. "Not much to get away from round here," he said. I shrugged, paid for gas and snacks, and got back on the road. The sun was nearly gone, and the sky was painted with shades of purple and orange. A chill was settling in the air as night crept over the land. I hadn't made a concrete plan for where to sleep, so I started looking for a campground or a motel. The next town on my map was about 20 miles down the road, a place called Edgewood. I figured I'd find something there. As I drove, the two-lane highway twisted through thick woods. Trees pressed close to the road, their branches scraping the edges of my truck. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. When I reached Edgewood, I found it even smaller than Millfield, just a handful of buildings around a crossroads. There was a motel with a flickering neon sign, but the parking lot was empty and the windows dark. I pulled up to the door and tried the handle, locked tight. There was a handwritten sign taped to the window, "Closed for renovations. Sorry for the inconvenience." I frowned. Not the best luck. I checked the GPS, but the signal was spotty here. The next nearest town was about 30 miles away, a place called Pine Hollow. I debated whether to push on or try to find a place to camp in the woods nearby. Deciding I'd rather be safe than sorry, I headed toward Pine Hollow. The road grew narrower and rougher, the pavement cracked and patched in places. The forest thickened on both sides, shadows lengthening beneath the canopy. After a while, I saw a small dirt turnout beside the road, with a clearing through the trees. I figured it could be a decent spot to set up my tent for the night. I pulled off and parked, then started unloading my gear. As I was pitching my tent, I noticed something strange. The air felt heavy, almost too still. The usual night sounds, crickets, frogs, were oddly quiet, as if the woods were holding their breath. I shook it off, blaming the sudden drop in temperature and my own imagination. Once my tent was up, I built a small fire from dry twigs and leaves. The flames flickered against the dark woods, casting eerie shadows. I sat back on a log, sipping coffee from my thermos. After a while, I heard something. A faint crunch of leaves, like footsteps, coming from just beyond the firelight. I froze, scanning the dark tree line. Nothing visible. "Hello?" I called out softly. No answer. The footsteps stopped. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I settled back down, but my heart was still pounding. I didn't sleep well that night. Every little sound made me tense. At one point, I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the edge of my firelight, tall, thin, motionless. When I flicked the flashlight toward it, there was nothing there. By dawn, I was packed up and eager to leave. As I drove back onto the highway, the sky pale with morning light, I passed a weathered wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Pine Hollow." I thought about stopping at the town's general store for supplies, but the road ahead felt restless. About 10 miles later, I noticed the truck's radio crackle and fade, the signal cutting in and out. Suddenly, the truck sputtered and lost power. I pulled over, heart sinking. I tried to restart the engine, but it just wheezed and died. I popped the hood and took a look, but everything seemed normal. No obvious leaks, no loose wires. I pulled out my phone, no signal. The isolation hit me fully for the first time. I sat on the edge of the road, trying to calm down and think. About a half hour later, a car approached slowly from the distance, headlights cutting through the early morning fog. It was an old sedan, paint-chipped and faded. It slowed as it passed me, then suddenly stopped a few yards ahead, right in the middle of the road. The driver's window rolled down, and a man inside looked at me with pale eyes. "Need help?" he asked. His voice was low and calm, but there was something off about him. "Yeah," I said. "My truck died. Do you know if there's a mechanic nearby?" He shook his head slowly. "Not really. The nearest is a few miles past the next town." I nodded. He looked at me a moment longer, then said, "You shouldn't be out here alone." I didn't know how to respond. The man drove off slowly, disappearing down the foggy road. I sat there a while longer, then decided to try to walk to the next town. I grabbed my pack and started down the road, the fog thickening and dampening every sound. After about 20 minutes, I reached a small cluster of buildings, what must have been Pine Hollow's main street. But the town felt deserted. No cars, no people, just boarded up storefronts and empty sidewalks. I checked the windows of what looked like the general store, dark, dust-covered, and locked tight. I wandered a bit, but no one appeared. A sudden chill ran down my spine. I decided to head back to my truck, but the fog had thickened so much I could barely see. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, no one. But the footsteps continued, matching my pace. I broke into a run, heart pounding. When I reached the truck, I found the engine had somehow started again. I jumped in, closed the door, and locked it. As I drove slowly down the road, the footsteps stopped. For a moment, I thought I saw figures standing in the trees, shadowy outlines watching me. The truck sputtered again as I approached the edge of town. I prayed the engine would hold. Eventually, I reached a stretch of open road where the fog thinned. The radio flickered back to life. I turned on some music, trying to calm myself. As the miles slipped by, I realized I didn't know what had just happened. Was I losing my mind, or had something out there been watching me? That night, I stopped at a motel in a bigger town. The clerk was polite but distant. "Did you have trouble on the road?" she asked when I checked in. I hesitated, then nodded. She gave me a knowing look. "Some roads aren't meant for wandering." I asked her what she meant, but she just smiled faintly. Over the next few days, I tried to shake the feeling of unease, but every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw something. A shape, a shadow lurking just out of sight. I took back roads, hoping to avoid highways, but the sense of being followed never left. One night, parked at a rest stop, I was jolted awake by tapping on the window. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it outside. Nothing, but then I noticed muddy footprints leading away from the truck into the woods. I never found where they went. By the time I returned home, I was exhausted, shaken. I told a few friends about the trip, but they thought I was exaggerating or imagining things. But I knew what I'd seen, what I'd felt. Somewhere out there on those quiet roads and in those empty towns, something watches. Something that doesn't want you to leave. The end. The sun was just beginning to set behind the hills as Kevin pulled his beat-up Chevy Impala onto the shoulder of Highway 89. The road trip had been spontaneous, a break from the usual grind of his college summer job in Michigan. Kevin, his best friend Lisa, and her younger brother Josh had set out that morning, planning to drive from Traverse City down to Nashville, Tennessee, chasing a mix of adventure and the fading warmth of late summer. The open road was supposed to be freedom, a chance to escape the suffocating routine of their small towns and college stress. They'd been driving for nearly 8 hours by then, the asphalt ribbon winding through thick forests and stretches of farmland. The sky was a canvas of oranges and purples, a perfect backdrop to the carefree music blaring from the speakers. The three of them had been laughing and joking for most of the trip, but as daylight faded, so did their sense of ease. Kevin glanced at the gas gauge and frowned. The tank was almost empty. "We need to find a station soon," he said, voice low but steady. Lisa frowned, scrolling through the GPS on her phone, though the signal had been patchy for the last hour. "The next station is supposed to be in about 15 miles, near that little town, Oak Ridge." Josh, sitting in the back, looked uneasy. "It's getting late. Are you sure we should stop there?" Kevin shrugged. "We don't have much choice. We're running on fumes." They continued down the 2-lane highway, trees thickening on either side. As darkness settled in fully, the road became eerily quiet, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional hoot of an owl. When they reached Oak Ridge, the place was a shadow of a town. The streetlights flickered sporadically, and most buildings appeared abandoned. The gas station they'd spotted on the GPS was a grimy little joint with a flickering neon sign reading "Open" in uneven letters. Kevin pulled in cautiously. The pumps were old, rusted, and looked barely functional. A solitary man stood behind the counter inside the convenience store, his face half hidden in shadow. Kevin opened the door, the bell above jingling weakly. The smell hit him immediately, a mix of stale smoke, damp wood, and something else he couldn't place. The man behind the counter didn't look up. "Hey, can I get a fill-up, please?" Kevin said, trying to keep his tone light. The man nodded, but said nothing. Instead, he shuffled slowly to the pumps, his movements jerky. Kevin filled the tank while Lisa and Josh waited inside, scanning the dimly lit shelves of the store. Inside, the air felt thick, almost oppressive. Lisa whispered, "This place gives me the creeps." Josh nodded. "I don't like it either. Let's get out of here." Kevin paid the man, who finally spoke in a voice low and gravelly. "Be careful on the road tonight. Not all is as it seems." Kevin raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. They got back in the car, the silence hanging heavy. The road ahead seemed narrower, the trees crowding closer. The only light came from the car's headlights, cutting through the darkness like a knife. About 10 miles down the road, Kevin noticed something strange in his rearview mirror. A pair of headlights, far behind but following steadily. The road had been empty since they left Oak Ridge. "Guys," Kevin said, his voice quieter now, "I think someone's behind us." Lisa glanced back. "Maybe just another traveler." But as the miles ticked by, the car behind maintained the same distance. Every time Kevin sped up, it sped up. Every time he slowed, it slowed. An unease settled in his gut. After a while, Kevin took a sharp turn onto a narrow gravel road that wasn't on the GPS. "I'm going to lose them," he muttered. Lisa protested. "Are you crazy? We don't even know where this goes." Kevin didn't answer. His eyes darted between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. The gravel road twisted deeper into the woods. The headlights behind didn't follow. Relief washed over Kevin briefly, until the radio, which had been silent for the past few minutes, burst to life with static and a voice whispering, "Turn back! Turn back!" Lisa gasped. Josh covered his ears. Kevin slammed on the brakes. "Did you hear that?" Lisa asked, her eyes wide. Kevin nodded slowly, heart pounding. "We need to keep moving." The road grew rougher, potholes threatening to throw the car off course. The dense forest pressed in on both sides, branches scraping the windows. Suddenly, the car stalled. Kevin tried to start the engine, but it only turned over weakly before dying completely. "We're stuck," he said, voice tight with panic. Lisa grabbed her phone. No signal. Josh's face was pale. "What now?" Kevin grabbed his flashlight from the glove compartment. "We're going to have to walk back to that gas station." Lisa and Josh exchanged a nervous glance, then nodded. The trio stepped out into the cool night air. The forest around them was silent, save for the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. The beam from the flashlight cut weakly through the blackness. As they walked, Kevin thought he heard footsteps behind them. Slow, deliberate. He stopped, shining the light back the way they came. Nothing. "Probably just an animal," he said, trying to sound confident. But then, from the shadows ahead, a figure stepped into the light. Tall, thin, dressed in ragged clothes, the man's face was pale and gaunt, eyes black as coal. "Why are you here?" the figure asked in a voice that was more a rasp than speech. Lisa screamed. Kevin stepped forward. "We're just passing through. Our car broke down." The figure's eyes narrowed with sorrow. "This is not a place for the living after dark." Josh whimpered, tugging Lisa's sleeve. Suddenly, the figure vanished into the trees. The three stood frozen. Minutes passed. Then the whispering started again, surrounding them. "Turn back! Turn back!" They ran without looking back, sprinting toward the dim glow of the gas station. When they reached it, the door was locked. No sign of the old man. Kevin pounded on the glass. Suddenly, the door creaked open on its own. Inside, the shelves were bare, the lights dead. A cold chill swept over them. And then, from the shadows, the figure appeared again. "Leave," it hissed. They didn't need to be told twice. They ran back to the car, which, miraculously, started on the first try. Kevin slammed the gas pedal, tires spinning as they fled down the gravel road. Behind them, the gas station faded into the darkness. The highway never felt so welcoming. When they finally reached a town with open lights and people, dawn was breaking. None of them ever spoke much about what happened on that stretch of road. But none of them forgot. Story the end. The sky was just beginning to lighten when we pulled out of the driveway, the air still crisp with the early morning chill of late September. My best friends, Jake and Lindsay, were already settled in the old blue Chevy Impala, the trunk packed with sleeping bags, snacks, and a few road trip essentials. The plan was simple: drive from our small town in Ohio all the way to the Badlands National Park in South Dakota, a trip of roughly 1,000 miles. We had about 4 days to spare before work pulled us back into reality. Jake was the driver. He'd taken road trips before and loved the idea of exploring less traveled back roads, the kind of places you'd find in travel guides but that few actually visited. Lindsay and I sat in the back seat, phones off, music playing softly, the excitement palpable. We talked about everything: the best roadside diners, strange town legends, the freedom of the open road. The first day was uneventful, a typical long drive filled with gas station stops and tired eyes. But as we crossed into Indiana and then Illinois, things started to feel a little off. It was subtle at first. The GPS signal flickered, cell service grew patchy. Jake joked about the area being dead zones, and Lindsay laughed, scrolling through her phone trying to find a signal. We took a detour, Jake suggested, off the interstate onto a state highway that promised scenic views and historical landmarks. The highway was narrow, flanked by dense woods that cast long shadows even though it was mid-afternoon. The speed limit dropped to 45, then 35, and the pavement started cracking in places. We passed through a tiny town with a name none of us had heard before: Harrow's End. The place looked frozen in time: old wooden storefronts, peeling paint, and a single gas station that looked like it had been closed for decades. No cars, no people. The silence was thick, like the kind that settles before a storm. We stopped to stretch and grab snacks at the one diner that was open, a small, cramped place called Martha's. The owner was a woman in her 70s with a weathered face and tired eyes. She didn't smile much, but she was polite. When we asked about the town, she just shrugged and said, "Harrow's End hasn't been the same since the accident." We pressed for details, but she changed the subject quickly. The patrons inside whispered among themselves, but avoided eye contact with us. Feeling uneasy, we left as soon as we could. Back in the car, Lindsay asked what kind of accident. Jake and I exchanged a look, but neither had an answer. The road ahead curved into the forest. The trees grew taller and denser. The sky dimmed behind the canopy. Suddenly, the radio flickered, static filling the cabin before the station came back with a voice announcing a weather warning: severe storms expected tonight. We debated turning back or pushing forward. Jake wanted to keep going. Lindsay and I weren't so sure. About 30 minutes later, the car's engine sputtered and died. Jake tried the ignition again and again, but it wouldn't turn over. The woods seemed to close in around us. The air grew colder. We stepped out, phones dead, no signal. We decided to walk back toward Harrow's End, hoping to find help. The path was narrow, tangled with roots and branches. Every step felt heavier. Then we heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps, coming from just beyond the trees. We stopped. No one was there. We moved faster, the tapping following us, echoing, never quite matching our pace. Night fell, and the forest transformed into a labyrinth of shadows and sounds. We finally saw the flicker of light, an old cabin with smoke curling from the chimney. We knocked, and the door creaked open. Inside, it was dark and cold. The smell of damp wood and something else: decay. We found an old journal on a table, its pages yellowed and brittle. It told a story of a family lost to the woods, whispers of strange figures with hollow eyes watching from the trees. Suddenly, the door slammed shut. In the darkness, we heard breathing. We ran. The forest seemed endless. At dawn, we stumbled onto the road and flagged down a trucker who promised to get us to the nearest town. We never spoke of what we saw in the woods. Sometimes late at night, I swear I hear tapping on my window. The end.